Welcome back, friends. Tonight, we're journeying to ancient India, an age when poetry danced on palace walls and mathematics whispered secrets of the stars. But before we settle in, a small favor. If you enjoy these calming dives into history, please consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps our little channel grow and keeps the stories flowing. And I'd love to know where in the world are you drifting off from tonight. Drop a comment below and let's keep building this quiet, global community. Now, take a deep breath, let the tension melt away, dim the lights, and let your body soften as we slip into the stillness of the past and explore the golden age of the Gupta Empire. In the hush of early dawn, before the sun crests the horizon over the Ganges plains, the world lies wrapped in a silken quiet. Imagine a traveler clothed in light cotton and dusted with the cool of morning, moving gently along a tree-lined road that winds past groves of mango trees and fields of golden wheat. The air is sweet with the scent of jasmine and distant cooking fires. Birds stir from sleep as temple bells chime faintly across the countryside. This is India in the 4th century CE, a land not yet carved by conquest or colonialism, but rising quietly into its own splendor. The empire that would come to define this age was the Gupta Empire dynasty, born not in fire and fury, but in alliance and legacy, while other empires of the ancient world expanded through brutal conquest. The Guptas wove their influence with careful diplomacy, intermarriage, and cultural generosity. Their world stretched across the northern heart of the Indian subcontinent, from the mouth of the Ganges in Bengal to the iron hills of central India, and all the way to the edges of the Hindu Kush. It was a civilization of vibrant cities, peaceful villages, humming monasteries, and royal courts brimming with poets, scholars, and astronomers. To those who lived through it, the Gupta age may have felt ordinary, but in hindsight, it glows. Historians would later name it the Golden Age of India, time when creativity flourished, knowledge deepened, and an enduring identity began to take shape. In quiet libraries and open courtyards, in the precise brushwork of Ajanta's murals and the pages of Kalidasa's verse, the Guptas cultivated a richness that still echoes through the corridors of Indian culture. Let us begin with the world they inherited. Before the Guptas, India had seen the rise and fall of the Mauryan Empire, a vast, centralized power that had briefly united much of the subcontinent under emperors like Ashoka. But after its collapse, India entered a long period of fragmentation, with dozens of smaller kingdoms, tribal coalitions, and regional powers vying for dominance. The Indo-Greeks, Shakas, and Kushans had left their mark on the northwest, while local dynasties sprouted across the Deccan and the south. It was a tapestry of cultures, languages, and beliefs, region diverse and decentralized, yet connected by trade, religion, and shared memory. Into this world stepped Chandragupta I, the founder of the Gupta dynasty, not to be confused with the earlier Chandragupta Maurya. His rise was steady and strategic. Around 320 CE, he married Kumara Devi, a princess of the powerful Licchavi clan, securing both political alliance and symbolic legitimacy. With her, he would claim not just territory, but lineage. Their union stitched together influence in the eastern Ganges basin, and Chandragupta I took the title Maharaj Dera, King of Kings. It was a bold claim, yet one that would soon be justified. From their capital at Pataliputram, modern-day Putna, the early Guptas built not just cities, but a vision. They envisioned a stable, prosperous, and culturally unified realm, one that prized learning and encouraged the flowering of Indian identity. Unlike empires that taxed heavily and ruled with absolute centralization, the Guptas governed with a lighter touch. Local kings and landlords retained autonomy, paying tribute and allegiance in return for protection and imperial recognition. Roads were maintained, trade routes were secured, and a coinage system bearing the emperor's face and divine symbols circulated across the land. This sense of harmony, political, economic, and spiritual, set the tone for what would follow. The Gupta rulers were not mere conquerors, they were patrons. They funded temples and monasteries, sponsored scholars and physicians, and invited poets to their courts. In this age, Sanskrit flourished not as a dead language of ritual, but as a living tongue of science, theater, and philosophy. Buddhist and Hindu institutions coexisted, each contributing to a cultural environment that prized exploration and expression over uniformity. Walk with me now through a quiet Gupta town. Clay walls, painted with lime wash, gleam in the midday sun. Artisans hum softly as they chisel stone or weave cotton thread. A teacher under a banyan tree recites verses to attentive students, while temple priests prepare offerings of fruit and flowers. Children laugh as they chase a carved wooden wheel along a dirt path. The air is filled with life, but it is not hurried. The rhythm of the day is measured, graceful. Evenings are reserved for music and poetry recitations, for storytelling and the reading of sacred texts by oil lamp. Here, time feels thick, slow, and full. This was not a perfect age, nor was it free of hardship. Droughts came, bandits roamed, caste divisions persisted. But for many, especially those in the urban middle and artisan classes, the Gupta period offered stability and opportunity. Farmers could count on consistent seasonal cycles. Merchants found eager buyers at bustling markets. Craftsmen were in high demand. Women, though subject to the limits of their era, had visibility in literature, art, and sometimes even in politics. Education was valued, and curiosity was not discouraged. In the soft light of dusk, let us pause by the river Sarasvati, said by many to have vanished into legend by this time. Its mythical waters remind us that history and mythology flowed together in the Gupta mind. The gods walked alongside kings. Epics like the Mahabharata and Ramayana were not just stories, but living scripts for life. Temples were not only places of worship, but centers of art, learning, and public life. Even science wore a cloak of wonder, as scholars like Aryabhata mapped the stars, not in cold calculation, but with reverence and joy. As the stars rise over the Gupta plains, flickering like ancient fires across the night sky, we begin to understand why this period shines so brightly in the historical memory. It is not simply because of its achievements, though they are many. It is because of its tone. The Gupta Golden Age whispers to us of balance, of beauty, of a civilization that did not rush, but ripened. It was an era that saw the power of story, the value of silence, and the slow unfolding of wisdom. In the chapters to come, we will drift deeper into this world. We will visit the poet kings and star watchers, the village potters and wandering monks, the mathematicians who dreamed of zero, and the sculptors who carved divinity into stones. Together, we will walk slowly and quietly through the whispers of the Gupta Golden Age, and as the night deepens around you, may those whispers guide you gently into sleep. In the golden hush after twilight, we return to a world suspended delicately between myth and memory, a world where kingdoms bloomed like lotuses across the Ganges plain, and dynasties rose not only by force, but by cleverness, timing, and the quiet strength of alliances. As you relax deeper into your pillow, we drift now toward the early days of the Gupta Empire, to a figure who stands at its very threshold. Chandragupta I, not a conqueror with fire in his wake, but a builder, a strategist, and the quiet architect of India's most radiant age. Let us begin not with a battle, but with a marriage. Around the year 320 CE, a royal wedding took place that would alter the shape of Indian history. Chandragupta I, a relatively modest ruler of the Gupta line, wed Kumaradevi, a princess of the Lichave clan, a powerful aristocratic family that held sway over regions in what is today northern Bihar. The ceremony, held perhaps in Pataliputra or in a Lichave stronghold, would not have been extraordinary in spectacle. There were garlands, chanting priests, oil lamps, and the smell of burning sandalwood. But the political consequences of that union would ripple for generations. This was more than a joining of hearts. It was a strategic move of enormous importance. Through Kumaradevi, Chandragupta I gained legitimacy, land, and influence. The Lichavis were highly respected, ancient, republican in tradition, and deeply rooted in regional governance. Their support bolstered the Gupta's prestige, offering a bridge between royal ambition and ancestral authority. On their early coins, Chandragupta I and Kumaradevi appear together, face to face, equally honored, an early indication of her significance and his acknowledgement of shared power. Prior to this, the Gupta name had not yet reached the grand heights that it would under their descendants. Chandragupta I's predecessors, like Sri Gupta and Gatotkacha, were likely local chieftains or minor kings rulers with limited domains, perhaps in the region near present-day Uttar Pradesh. These early Guptas laid foundations, but it was Chandragupta I who would stretch their shadow far and wide, setting the empire's golden dawn into motion. He adopted the regal title, Maharajadhira, Great King of Kings, a term echoing with ambition. It was not a title given lightly. In ancient India, such a claim implied the submission or alliance of lesser kings, the consolidation of lands, and the confidence to position oneself within a cosmic order of kingship. It connected the king to dharma, to righteous rule, and to the traditions of ancient epics. In some ways, Chandragupta I was not merely becoming a ruler. He was casting himself in the mold of characters like Yudhishthira and Rama, ethical, powerful, and wise. Under his rule, the capital city of Pataliputra blossomed anew. Nestled near the confluence of the Ganges and Sun rivers, Pataliputra had once served as the seat of the Mauryan Empire. Its city walls, wooden palisades, watchtowers, and moat systems had faded with time, but the spiritual memory of its glory still lingered. Chandragupta I revived this ancestral heartbeat. He rebuilt roads and re-established networks of trade, from Bengal's coastal ports to the Himalayan foothills and westward toward the Silk Roads, threading through Bactria and beyond. One can imagine the sounds of that growing city, ox carts creaking under the weight of clay pots, traders calling out offers of saffron and cardamom, temple chants rising above the murmur of market stalls. Sculptors shaped granite and sandstone into temple friezes. Scholars gathered in courtyards to debate astronomy and grammar. Above it all, royal proclamations were etched into copper plates and stone, recording land grants to Brahmins, temples, and monasteries, codes of which survive today. But Chandragupta I was not only focused on the city. His strength lay in his ability to unify diverse regions through a combination of alliance, tolerance, and subtle statecraft. He did not attempt to erase local identities or force a monolithic structure onto his realm. Instead, he let regions breathe, maintaining local rulers and practices so long as they pledged loyalty. In this way, he avoided unnecessary rebellion, allowing cultural diversity to coexist within an imperial framework. This inclusivity, perhaps unusual for its time, laid the groundwork for a uniquely pluralistic culture to thrive. Temples to Vishnu stood not far from Buddhist viharas. Jain monks walked barefoot past Brahmin scholars. Though the Guptas were nominally Hindu, their rule was not marked by religious oppression. Instead, Chandragupta I cultivated a spiritual landscape rich in dialogue and mutual respect. Economically, this period also witnessed gentle revival. The Gupta coinage, minted in gold, began under Chandragupta I and would become a hallmark of the empire. These coins, beautifully struck and adorned with images of deities, kings, and even royal couples, weren't just currency. They were statements of identity, of divine favor, and of political continuity. The very act of placing both himself and Kumaradevi on their joint coin spoke volumes. This was an age where partnership and prosperity walked hand in hand. As the empire stabilized and expanded, land became a tool of governance. Grants were issued to Brahmins and educational institutions, transferring not just land, but the revenues associated with them. These donations helped cement loyalty and empowered centers of learning across the kingdom. In return, the state received not only religious blessings, but the preservation and spread of Sanskrit learning, a cycle that would spiral into the literary and scientific efflorescence we now associate with the Gupta age. As the years passed, Chandragupta I's realm grew in quiet strength. He may not have been the most flamboyant of rulers, nor did he leave behind soaring monuments or dramatic victories in battle, but his legacy lay in the stability he forged, the rarest of gifts in a time of fragmented rule. Under his reign, roads were safe, harvests secure, and court life rich with potential. Evenings at his palace likely shimmered with the sound of Veena strings and the murmur of Sanskrit verse. Diplomats from smaller kingdoms came bearing tribute. Monks returned from long pilgrimages with news of the western deserts and distant peaks. Chandragupta I, now an elder statesman, would have watched his son Samudragupta rise, a prince with poetry in his soul and conquest in his dreams. The baton was ready to pass not in desperation, but with confidence. Indeed, if Chandragupta I's reign was the laying of the foundation, then Samudragupta's would be the first story built atop it. The father made peace. The son would test its boundaries. But before we follow that path, let us linger here in the final quiet years of Chandragupta's life. In the gentle glow of an oil lamp, an aged king reclines on a carved sandalwood seat, listening to verses from the Vedas. Outside, the monsoon has passed, and the air is cool. The people of Pataliputra rest easy, unaware that their descendants will one day call this their golden age. For now, there is only the present, the quiet rule of a king who saw farther than most and planted seeds that would bloom across centuries. As dawn breaks over the vast northern plains of the Indian subcontinent, sunlight spills across the Ganges, warming the walls of Pataliputra, the proud capital of a growing empire. In the hush of early morning, the empire stirs to life, not with the clash of weapons or the cry of war, but with the softer sounds of purpose. A royal court prepares to receive guests. A scribe copies verses onto fresh palm leaves. A sculptor readies stone for another royal commission. The age of Chandragupta I has passed, but his legacy breathes onward now through the actions of his son, Samudragupta, the Golden Warrior, poet king, and patron of an age that would dazzle for generations to come. Samudragupta, who reigned from approximately 335 to 375 CE, was a paradox wrapped in silk and steel. He was, according to ancient records, both fierce conqueror and gentle artist. In one hand, he held a sword stained with the soil of 100 campaigns. In the other, a quill for composing Sanskrit poetry. His rule was one of momentum and magnitude, a time when the Gupta Empire expanded its reach through both diplomacy and the drumbeat of war, but also refined its culture into something elegant, enduring, and almost divine. To understand Samudragupta is to first understand his place in the imperial vision. He inherited an already stable domain, carefully shaped by Chandragupta I, with its economic base secure and its legitimacy reinforced through strategic alliances. The stage was set for a young ruler of ambition to carve a name into the granite of history. And Samudragupta, it seems, was not content to simply maintain the realm. He would elevate it, expand it, and immortalize it. Our most enduring source for Samudragupta's life and deeds comes not from rumor or epic, but from a single polished sandstone pillar, the Allahabad pillar inscription, etched in flawless Sanskrit and composed in lofty verse. This inscription reads like both biography and praise sanga, formal declaration of his military feats and imperial virtues. It paints him as a Chakravartin, a universal ruler whose conquests spread like ripples across a pond, touching every border of the known world. He began his campaigns in the north, subduing neighboring kings and petty dynasties. His military strategy was swift and overwhelming, characterized by mobility and precision. Yet, what makes Samudragupta's conquests especially fascinating is his nuanced approach to governance. Not all defeated rulers were destroyed. Many were reinstated as vassals, allowed to govern under Gupta suzerainty, so long as they paid tribute and acknowledged the supremacy of the emperor. In this way, Samudragupta did not fracture the land he conquered. He stitched it together with threads of obligation and respect. His campaigns stretched in all directions. To the east, he defeated the forest kings and tribal territories. To the south, he launched a daring and ambitious series of expeditions into the Deccan, crossing rivers, forests, and mountains to challenge rulers like the Pallavas. Though he did not annex these distant lands, his victories left a deep impression. Kings in the south sent embassies bearing precious gifts. Some offered their daughters in marriage. Others simply carved his name into their own records, acknowledging a power too great to resist. Samudragupta's southern conquests were not a quest for permanent control. They were symbolic assertions of supremacy, demonstration that the Gupta reach was more than geographic. It was spiritual, cultural, even cosmic. He became not just a ruler of land, but of legitimacy itself. His image as conqueror served a purpose: to bind a diverse subcontinent under a singular ideal of Dharma-infused kingship. And yet, the sword alone did not define him. Samudragupta was also called Kaviraja, king of poets. He composed Sanskrit verse, supported scholars, and filled his court with musicians, philosophers, and orators. In a period when Sanskrit literature was undergoing a quiet renaissance, His own words, sadly lost to time, were said to rival the great poets. He played the veena, a stringed instrument that demanded both technical skill and emotional nuance. To picture him is to imagine a ruler who would sheath his sword at twilight, retreat to his chambers, and compose melodies by lamplight while moonlight shimmered on the Ganges. This harmony between war and wisdom was no accident. It was rooted in a larger cultural vision. For Samudragupta, a king who mastered poetry and music showed mastery over his own senses. A court filled with dancers and sages revealed the prosperity of the state. The arts were evidence that the realm was at peace, that its spirit was nourished, and that its ruler did not only command bodies, but hearts. Religion, too, played a central role in this vision. Though the Guptas were primarily Hindu devotees of Vishnu, in particular, their policy was one of religious tolerance. Samudragupta's own court likely included Brahmins, Buddhist monks, and Jain ascetics. His empire issued land grants to temples and monasteries alike. He is even recorded as permitting the king of Ceylon to build a monastery in Bodh Gaya, the site of the Buddha's enlightenment. Such actions reflect a broader spiritual generosity, recognition that true kingship transcended sectarian boundaries. As you breathe slowly and settle into stillness, picture the emperor in his full regalia, draped in embroidered silk, his brow marked with sandalwood paste, a golden sword at his side, and a veena balanced gently in his lap. Around him, ministers discuss trade routes, poets recite verses, and sculptors present delicate carvings meant to adorn a temple wall. In this room, decisions are made that will ripple across centuries, yet the tone is one of grace, not urgency. This is not a court of fear. It is a court of vision. We must also consider his impact on administration. Samudragupta maintained the Gupta policy of decentralized control, appointing local governors and officials who were often drawn from influential families within their own regions. This minimized rebellion and strengthened loyalty. Records of land grants, revenue collection, and local law enforcement were carefully maintained. His government, while not bureaucratically massive, was impressively efficient, a delicate balance of central authority and regional autonomy. The coins minted during Samudragupta's reign are among the finest of ancient India. They depict the emperor in various poses, performing a horse sacrifice, playing the veena, or simply standing in heroic poise, sword raised. These coins were not just for trade. They were artifacts of propaganda, circulating a controlled image of the emperor across the empire. The use of Sanskrit, the elegance of the engravings, and the recurring divine symbols all pointed to a sovereign who ruled not by birthright alone, but by cosmic favor. As his reign drew on, Samudragupta's empire reached its zenith. The Gupta name was now known from the Himalayan passes to the coasts of the Bay of Bengal. Foreign rulers sent envoys bearing gifts and requests for friendship. Artists flocked to the court, eager for patronage. Roads were safer, trade more vibrant, and the great city's Pataliputra, Ujjain, Mathura bustled with life. And in the background, the sacred rhythms of Sanskrit literature continued to deepen, preparing the soil for the flowering genius of Kalidasa and others. But history is not frozen. Even in moments of brilliance, time marches on. Toward the end of his life, Samudragupta prepared his son Chandragupta, to later known as Vikramaditutu, inherit the mantle. It would be a smooth transition, for the foundation was solid, and the empire's culture was thriving. In death, Samudragupta would become a legend, not just of war, but of wisdom. Tonight, as you rest beneath the soft weight of silence, let your thoughts drift to a time when emperors recited poems, when gold coins carried art as well as value, and when an empire grew not just in size but in soul. Samudragupta, the king of kings and king of poets, invites us to imagine a rule where power and beauty walked side by side. In the deep velvet of night, when stars shimmer like ancient prayers cast into the sky, a hush falls over the empire. But in the quiet halls of a royal court, lit by the flicker of ghee lamps and cooled by sandalwood breezes, a man in silks draws a bow gently across the strings of a veena. His fingers, calloused from war, yet supple with discipline, summon notes that drift like incense into the dark. Around him, courtiers listen in reverent silence. This man is no mere musician. He is emperor. And in this moment, music and majesty are one. This is Samudragupta, the poet on the throne. The image might seem extraordinary to those more familiar with kings as conquerors. But in Gupta India, where aesthetic refinement was not merely tolerated but exalted, Samudragupta stood as a rare embodiment of dual excellence, the warrior poet, the sovereign who both subdued kingdoms and composed verse to honor the moon. In this chapter, we linger in that quieter aspect of his reign, the one less chronicled by historians and more whispered by stone carvings, golden coins, and half-remembered lines of Sanskrit. To appreciate Samudragupta as a patron of the arts, we must first understand the cultural landscape he inherited. The early centuries of the Common Era in India were marked by a flowering of Sanskrit literary traditions. While Prakrit had served as the language of the masses and of earlier Buddhist texts, Sanskrit retained an aura of formality, sacredness, and intellectual prestige. It was the language of the Vedas, the Upanishads, and the Mahabharata. But under the Guptas, it became more than the language of religion. It became the language of creativity, philosophy, and political sophistication. Samudragupta, educated by the best minds in his court, was well versed in this tradition. Though only fragments of his poetry survive him referenced, obliquely, by later writers, his reputation as Kaviraja, or King of Poets, endured. The title was not honorary. It reflected genuine literary accomplishment, a cultivated sensibility, and an environment where poetic expression was a virtue of leadership, not a distraction from it. Imagine, then, a typical evening in his court. After the affairs of the empire have been tended to, discussions of diplomacy, revenue, border skirmishes, and trade, the emperor retires, not to his private chambers, but to a salon of poets and musicians. There, under carved tick beams and embroidered canopies, bards recite couplets from the Ramayana or compose spontaneous verses upon request. Courtiers clap softly in appreciation. A dancer performs a slow, expressive piece evoking the love between Radha and Krishna. Then, at the emperor's nod, a veena is placed in his lap, and the court stills in anticipation. What kind of poetry would an emperor compose? Likely, it would be rich in metaphor, invoking the celestial movements of planets, the grandeur of rivers like the Ganges, and the ethereal beauty of lotus petals at dawn. But perhaps it also carried undertones of introspection, reflections on impermanence, duty, and the burden of kingship. For even a man of gold must reckon with shadow. More than a performer, Samudragupta was a patron of vital role in any civilization's artistic growth. He funded temples that doubled as galleries, encouraged sculpture and painting, and created a court atmosphere where scholars and artists felt valued. This climate would eventually produce legends like Kalidasa and Aryabhuta, though they likely flourished under his successors. Still, without Samudragupta's precedent of integrating art into governance, the path would have been slower, dimmer. One of the most illuminating pieces of evidence for Samudragupta's aesthetic identity comes from coinage, small, circular records that traveled across the empire and beyond. While earlier Indian coins featured abstract symbols or simple royal portraits, Gupta coins, especially those from Samudragupta's reign, were intricate, expressive, and full of narrative detail. One particularly famous gold coin depicts the emperor playing the veena. His body is angled in a relaxed, musical posture, and the instrument is delicately etched, emphasizing not just regal power, but personal elegance. This is more than vanity. These coins served as visual propaganda, projecting the ruler's identity into every market and village. In an age without mass media, this imagery spoke volumes to the average subject or merchant handling such a coin. The message was clear. This was a ruler who not only defended the borders, but uplifted the spirit. A man who governed through both strength and serenity. The same court that nurtured poetry also supported music and dance. Ancient treatises, like the Natya Shastranan encyclopedic guide to drama, music, and performance, were likely referenced and honored. Under Samudragupta, classical Indian music may have seen refinements in raga systems, while dance styles like Bharatanatyam, or its northern cousin, possibly ancestral to Kathak, continued to develop in temples and palaces alike. These were not mere entertainments. They were seen as spiritual disciplines, ways to align human emotion with cosmic order. Religion, too, intertwined with these cultural expressions. The Guptas favored Vaishnavism, the worship of Vishnu, but their patronage extended to Shiva temples, Buddhist viharas, and Jain shrines. In fact, one of Samudragupta's land grants allowed a Sri Lankan king to build a Buddhist monastery at Bodh Gaya, the sacred site of Siddhartha Gautama's enlightenment. This was no empty gesture. It symbolized a vision of kingship as inclusive, cosmopolitan, and spiritually attuned. At the core of Samudragupta's cultural strategy was an ideal borrowed from ancient scriptures, that of the Rayarsi, the philosopher king. This was no tyrant, nor even a mere administrator, but a ruler who cultivated inner wisdom alongside worldly order. The Rayarsi governed with compassion, upheld dharma, and strove not only to expand territory, but to elevate consciousness. Samudragupta, with his poetry, music, and learning, modeled this ideal with unusual fidelity. Let us take a quiet walk through a Guptara temple complex, perhaps one sponsored by Samudragupta himself. The sun hangs low as birds wheel overhead. Bells chime softly in the evening wind. The temple walls are adorned with bas-relief scenes from the Ramayana carved in flowing, elegant lines. Within the sanctum, a priest tends to a flame that has burned for centuries. Outside, a young boy recites Sanskrit verses from memory, his voice steady and sure. Somewhere, in the periphery, the emperor listens unseen, his heart full. There is no record of Samudragupta's later years in great detail. We can imagine him growing older, still sharp of mind, perhaps composing poems, even as his body grew frail. His son, Chandragupta II, was being prepared for the throne. The court still bustled, the arts still thrived, but time, as always, moved gently forward. And so, the poet king passed into legend. His victories were recorded, yes, but so too were his values. The idea that a ruler could be graceful, that empire could be shaped with a lyre as well as a sword. Under his successors, the Gupta cultural renaissance would explode into full bloom. But the seed was planted by Samudragupta beautifully, enduringly. As you lie back now, breathing slowly, know that you are not merely listening to history. You are hearing echoes of music that once filled palace halls, the cadence of Sanskrit whispered under starlight, and the heartbeat of a civilization that found room for both logic and lyric, conquest and contemplation. The hush of early morning stretches across the vast plains of Magadha, where the mists of dawn curl like soft cotton over the earth. Birds begin their gentle calls, and distant temple bells murmur into the wind. In a quiet grove, sandalwood trees sway as a line of saffron-robed students walk barefoot, scrolls pressed gently to their chests toward the rising silhouette of an ancient university. There, between red sandstone walls and tiled roofs warmed by the sun, lies Nalanda, sanctuary of thought, learning, and sacred silence. Tonight, we leave behind the gilded halls of emperors and step instead into a quieter world, one ruled not by kings, but by ideas. In this chapter, we walk slowly through the birth and blossoming of India's scholarly tradition during the Gupta Age, a time when knowledge was revered as deeply as devotion, and a village boy with a mind like fire could ascend the steps of greatness through the power of learning alone. While Nalanda would reach its peak in later centuries, it first emerged during the Gupta period, likely under the patronage of Kumaragupta I. Its early roots, however, stretched deep into the soil of Brahminical and Buddhist scholarship, already thriving in the region. Situated near present-day Bihar, Nalanda was perfectly placed close to ancient trade routes, sacred Buddhist sites like Bodh Gaya, and within reach of Gupta influence. What began as a modest center for Buddhist teaching would soon blossom into the most celebrated university of the ancient world. Picture it now, as it might have been during its early rise. Dozens of buildings rise from the earth like terraced temples. Each one houses classrooms, libraries, dormitories, and meditation halls. Monks and lay students alike wander the stone paths, engaged in deep conversation or silent reflection. From the outside, the campus appears serene, almost monastic, but within, it buzzes with the energy of intellectual curiosity, not loud but constant. The scratching of reed pens on birch bark, the soft chant of memorized verses, the murmur of debate that begins at dawn and stretches into the night. What made Nalanda special was not just its size, but its spirit. It was a melting pot of cultures, beliefs, and disciplines. While originally founded as a Buddhist institution, Nalanda never limited itself to a single tradition. Hindu philosophy, Jain, ethics, logic, astronomy, grammar, medicine, and even foreign texts found a home within its walls. Students came from across India, but also from distant lands: Tibet, China, Korea, even Persia. For many, Nalanda was not just a school. It was a pilgrimage of the mind. The curriculum was vast and rigorous. Students studied logic, grammar, philosophy, metaphysics, astronomy, and medicine. Instruction was oral and dialogic, rooted in the ancient Indian tradition of guru and shishya, teacher and student. Pupils memorized complex texts, but they also engaged in active debate, sharpening their understanding through discourse. This was no rote learning. This was education as transformation, shaping not only intellect but character. One of Nalanda's most remarkable features was its library, known by the poetic name Dharmaganya, the treasury of truth. It was not a single room. but a complex of three grand buildings, Ratnadadi and Ratnaranjaka. These housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, covering every subject imaginable in the classical Indian world. The collection was so extensive, it was said that even when parts of Nalanda were later destroyed, the fires in its libraries burned for months. The knowledge preserved here would flow outward across Asia, carried by pilgrims and scholars. Among them was the famous Chinese monk Xuanzang, who arrived in India in the 7th century CE. Though Nalanda had already become a beacon in the Gupta period before his time, Xuanzang studied at Nalanda for years, mastering Sanskrit and absorbing the nuances of Indian philosophy. He later described the university in vivid detail, praising its scale, its discipline, and its atmosphere of quiet reverence. But the Gupta commitment to learning did not end with Nalanda. Across the empire, ashrams, gurukuls, monasteries, and temple schools served as smaller but equally vital nodes of knowledge. Education was available primarily to the upper classes Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and some Vaishyaspa. Mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and medicine were all studied in depth. The Gupta era was one of synthesis, where empirical observation was paired with spiritual understanding, and where scholars sought harmony between the material and metaphysical. Take, for example, Indian scholars, building upon earlier traditions, made precise calculations about the movement of planets and stars. They knew the Earth was spherical, understood eclipses, and developed intricate calendars based on both lunar and solar cycles. These weren't just abstractions, they helped guide agricultural cycles, temple rituals, and daily life. In the quiet of a Gupta observatory, a scholar might sit beneath a canopy of stars, recording the heavens with the same reverence a monk gave to a mantra. One of the towering intellectual figures of this period was Aryabhata, whose work would define Indian astronomy and mathematics for centuries. Born in 476 CE, likely during the late Gupta period, Aryabhata studied and taught in Kusumapura, believed to be another name for Pataliputra. His magnum opus, the Aryabhashya, covered topics from algebra and trigonometry to planetary motion. He proposed that the Earth rotated on its axis, calculated pi to 4 decimal places, and developed sine tables centuries before similar advances appeared in Europe. His work, written in precise Sanskrit verse, was a blend of lyrical beauty and mathematical genius. This commitment to learning also extended to medicine and health. Gupta physicians followed the classical Ayurvedic texts, treating the body as a system of interconnected energies, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. They performed surgeries, treated wounds with herbal poultices, and developed complex diagnostic methods. Medical knowledge was taught alongside spiritual ethics, emphasizing not just treatment but compassion. Hospitals were established in major cities, often attached to temples or funded by the royal court. Here, healing was seen as a form of dharma, a duty sacred to both doctor and patient. Education during the Gupta period was also deeply intertwined with art and aesthetics. Students of sculpture, dance, and music were trained with as much discipline as their philosophical counterparts. The arts were not seen as separate from intellect, but as extensions of it. A sculptor needed to understand geometry and proportion. A dancer needed to master rhythm and narrative structure. A musician had to study both melody and the emotional rasa it evoked. In Gupta India, to create was to know. Let us pause, then, in a stone courtyard under the neem tree, where a young boy recites Panini's grammar rules aloud. while sparrows flit overhead. His master listens, nodding quietly, correcting his meter. Nearby, another student studies a star chart, his fingers stained with lamp soot. The air smells of ink and wet clay. The only sound is the gentle rustling of leaves and the cadence of memorized verse. These were the true monuments of the Gupta Golden Age, not built of marble or guarded by soldiers, but constructed from thought, memory, and the relentless pursuit of understanding. The knowledge preserved and produced in this time would ripple outward through the Islamic Golden Age, influence Southeast Asian kingdoms, and later inspire scholars in Europe and the Islamic world. But perhaps its most lasting legacy lies in something quieter, a world view that placed knowledge at the center of life. In the Gupta ethos, wisdom was not hoarded, it was shared. It was not opposed to faith, but guided by it. And in the halls of Nalanda and its sister institutions, that vision found form-etched into every stone step, every palm leaf manuscript, and every softly spoken verse. Even as the lamps flicker out across the dormitories of Nalanda, and the scent of ink and parchment fades into the coolness of evening, the pulse of a different kind of brilliance begins to stir, not in the silence of study, but in the rhythm of verse. From the scholarly to the sublime, from logic to lyricism, we now step into the heart of India's literary awakening during the Gupta Empire. In this chapter, we turn our gaze toward the most luminous voice of that age, a man whose words still echo through centuries with the power of moonlight and thunder. His name was Kalidasa, and in the stillness of the night, we walk into the Sanskrit Renaissance he helped shape. Kalidasa is perhaps India's greatest classical poet and dramatist, revered as a master of metaphor, melody, and emotional depth. His name means servant of Kali, the fierce goddess of time and transformation, though his works rarely show the ferocity of his namesake. Instead, Kalidasa's verses are marked by gentleness, romance, and cosmic beauty. He lived and wrote during the Gupta period, possibly under the patronage of Chandragupta, the second Samudragupta's son, and his presence in that golden court helped define the age as much as any victory or monument. Very little is known of Kalidasa's life. He left behind no personal letters, no carved declarations, and no confirmed biography. What we do have are stories, half myth, half memory, passed down through generations of admirers. Some say he was an uneducated man granted sudden wisdom by divine blessing. Others imagine him as a court poet of refinement and learning. But perhaps that mystery is fitting. For Kalidasa lived not in the facts of life, but in its felt experience, in the blush of lovers parting, the sigh of clouds above a mountain ridge, the joy of rain on a parched field. His most celebrated works include the plays Shakuntala, Malavika, and Agnimitra, and Vikramorvosha, the epic poems Raghuvamasha and Kumarasambhava, and the lyrical elegy Meghaduta, or the Cloud Messenger. Each of these texts opens a different window into Guptara sensibility. They are not merely entertainments, they are meditations on love, duty, nature, and the divine, all woven with breathtaking language and delicate structure. Let us begin with Shakuntala, perhaps his most famous work. The play is based on a story from the Mahabharata, yet Kalidasa transforms it into something uniquely his own. It tells of King Dushyanta, who falls in love with the forest-dwelling maiden Shakuntala. After a secret marriage, he returns to his court, promising to send for her. But a sage's curse causes him to forget her entirely until, after trials and separations, they are finally reunited. This may sound like a simple tale of love and loss, but Kalidasa's magic lies in the way he tells it. His forests are alive with whispering trees and hidden deer. His characters speak in soft metaphors and layered poetry. Even silence becomes meaningful. A raised eyebrow, a shy glance, a drooping flowerol serve as language. Watching or reading Shakuntala is less like hearing a story and more like stepping into a painting, gentle, warm, and profoundly human. Another of his masterpieces, Meghaduta, is a long lyrical poem that tells the story of a yaksha, or nature spirit, exiled by his king for neglecting his duties in the ecstasy of love, lonely and longing for his distant wife. The yaksha spots a monsoon cloud and begs it to carry a message to her across the country. What follows is not a conventional plot, but a lush, evocative journey across the Indian landscape, rivers, hills, forests, and cities, described with such richness that it feels like traveling in a dream. In Meghaduta, Kalidasa achieves something extraordinary. He turns geography into emotion. Every river is a longing, every mountain a memory. The journey of the cloud becomes the journey of love itself, slow, mournful, and filled with aching beauty. As you listen now, imagine the steady pace of that cloud, gliding across a sky dark with rain, its belly heavy with the size of a lonely heart. That is the world Kalidasa offers us, one where nature and feeling are not separate, but mirrors of each other. In addition to drama and lyric, Kalidasa also wrote court epics-long narrative poems that combined myth, history, and political idealism. His Raghuvamsha traces the lineage of the legendary Raghu dynasty, to which the hero Rama belonged. Kumarosambhava, the birth of Kumara, tells of the romance between Shiva and Parvati and the birth of their son, the warrior god Kartikeya. These works blend heroism with intimacy, using elaborate Sanskrit meter and dense symbolism to elevate their subjects into near divinity. But even in these loftier epics, Kalidasa never loses his touch for the human and the tender. A grieving queen, a bashful bride, a lovesick, ascetic each is painted with careful detail and compassion. In his hands, kings are not merely rulers, they are lovers, fathers, seekers. Gods are not distant, but present in the rustle of trees and the scent of rain-soaked earth. His language is rich, but never dry, layered, but never opaque. Like the veena or the sitar, it sings. Kalidasa's genius also lies in his synthesis of diverse traditions. He draws from Vedic mythology, Buddhist imagery, local folklore, and classical philosophy, weaving them into a seamless whole. His work reflects a world where contradictions are welcomed, where reason and mysticism coexist, where order and passion walk hand in hand. This reflects the broader ethos of the Gupta period itself, time not of rigid dogma, but of intellectual and artistic freedom, of respectful debate and mutual inspiration. It's no wonder, then, that later generations came to see Kalidasa as the pinnacle of Sanskrit literary achievement. His influence would echo through the courts of southern India, across Southeast Asia, and into the scholarly texts of China and the Arab world. His dramas were performed in temples and palaces. His verses were memorized by children and scholars alike. Even today, in Indian universities and classrooms, his words are studied not merely for their historical value, but for their timeless beauty. We may wonder what kind of man Kalidasa truly was. Did he live in a quiet village, walking each morning through groves of neem and banyan, crafting lines in solitude? Or did he dwell in the royal court, entertaining kings and queens with recitations and riddles? Was he devout, playful, melancholic, or wise beyond his years? We cannot say. But perhaps that mystery is part of his gift. For Kalidasa invites us not to know him, but to know ourselves through love, through nature, through the rhythms of language that echo even now in the chambers of our hearts. As the night deepens and the stars slip silently overhead, let us pause by a lotus pond in some imagined Gupta courtyard. The moon reflects gently on the water. Somewhere unseen, a poet's voice murmurs a verse to the breeze. The heart remembers what the eyes have forgotten. Even the wind carries the fragrance of her sigh. And so we remember Tunat. In the poetry of Kalidasa, the Gupta age found its soul knot, carved in stone, but spoken in whisper, written in ink, and held in memory. As dawn slips across the northern plains, like a silk shawl drawn gently over the shoulders of the earth, a different rhythm begins, quieter than the songs of poets, slower than the march of armies. In the rustling of banyan leaves and the creak of a wooden wheel, in the clang of a blacksmith's hammer and the hush of morning prayers whispered into the wind, we find ourselves in the heart of the empire, not in its palaces or libraries, but in the small, breathing world of its villages. In this chapter, we turn away from emperors and scholars to walk instead down dusty paths, past grain fields and wells, through narrow lanes lined with clay homes. Here, in the ordinary lives of farmers, artisans, mothers, monks, and children, we see how the great Gupta Empire was not simply ruled, but lived. At the heart of every Gupta village lay a rhythm shaped by nature. Time was measured not by hours or minutes, but by the sun's slow arc across the sky, the chirping of cicadas, the flowering of crops, and the ebb and flow of the seasons. Villages were usually small, ranging from a few dozen to a few hundred families, nestled amid fields of wheat, rice, barley, sugarcane, and lentils. The soil, rich and dark from generations of careful cultivation, yielded the lifeblood of the empire grain to fill stomachs, fodder for animals, and surplus for trade. Most villagers were land-bound cultivators, their days beginning before sunrise. A father might wake to the lowing of cattle, his sons already stirring to prepare the plow. The air was cool, damp with dew, and filled with the earthy scent of damp soil and smoke from cooking fires. Oxen were yoked to wooden plows, reinforced with iron tips, their hooves steady as they turned the land. Behind them, seeds were cast by hand, with careful precision, fingered through generations of tradition. The tools of the trade were simple but effective: plows, sickles, baskets for threshing, water wheels for irrigation. Wells and tanks captured rainwater, especially vital in regions where rivers ran dry after the monsoon. The irrigation systems, small canals and bunds were often maintained collectively by village labor. Cooperation wasn't just encouraged, it was necessary. A broken channel could wither fields. A delayed sowing could cost an entire season's yield. Homes in the village were modest, built of mud bricks or compacted earth, with thatched roofs and small inner courtyards. A single-room hut might house an entire family, parents, children, and sometimes grandparents, all living under one roof. In warmer months, people often slept on woven charpoys beneath the open sky, cooled by breezes and watched over by the stars. Cooking was done over clay stoves, using firewood or dried cow dung cakes. Pots were earthen water, drawn from the common well, and meals typically consisted of rice or wheat with pulses, vegetables, ghee, and pickles preserved in clay jars. Village life was deeply communal. Neighbors helped build homes, celebrate festivals, and mourn losses. Decisions were made in councils under the village tree, often a large banyan or nimware. Elders, landowners, and learned Brahmins gathered to settle disputes and guide collective actions. These panchayats were informal yet respected, rooted in tradition and reinforced by shared values. Justice was restorative more than punitive. Fines, social reproach, and ritual atonement preferred over violent punishment. The Varna system or caste hierarchy was present and shaped much of village structure. Brahmins performed rituals and interpreted sacred texts. Kshatriyas, if present, were landowners or warriors in service to regional rulers. Vaishyas handled trade and business, and Shudras worked as laborers, weavers, potters, or artisans. Yet in practice, roles were more fluid than rigid, especially in rural areas, where survival often depended on versatility and cooperation. People worked side by side, bound less by law than by need and local custom. Women played a vital role in maintaining household and cultural life. Though patriarchal norms shaped inheritance and authority, women in Gupta villages were far from passive figures. They rose before dawn, fetched water, cooked, spun cotton, cared for livestock, and managed household finances. Older women offered herbal remedies, advised young brides, and led devotional songs during rituals. In fields and markets, women were both laborers and decision-makers, their strength woven into the very grain of the community. Children, too, were raised with care and purpose. Boys learned their father's trade or were sent to village teachers, gurus, who instructed students beneath shady trees in grammar, ethics, and scripture. Education was simple but disciplined, based on oral repetition and memorization. Girls were taught household skills, devotional songs, and sometimes reading and writing if their families were learned or prosperous. Childhood was short, responsibilities came early, but play still thrived in the splash of river baths, in games of marbles and spinning tops, in tales told by grandmothers beneath flickering oil lamps. Festivals marked the pulse of the year, their colors and music washing over daily toil like monsoon rains on parched land. Villages came alive with song and celebration during harvest, during Holi and Diwali, during the spring worship of Saraswati, or the summer rains of Krishna Jamashtami. Clay lamps lit doorways, drums echoed across fields, and dancers swirled in bright garments stitched with gold thread. Cows were bathed and painted. Idols of gods were fashioned from mud, worshipped, and then returned to the earth. In these moments, the sacred and the seasonal merged into one. Religion was ever present, but not oppressive. Shrines and temples dotted the landscapes, some dedicated to Vishnu or Shiva, others to local goddesses or village spirits. Every home had a small altar, every field its guardian deity. Daily life was intertwined with ritual and reverence, lighting a lamp at dusk, tying red threads on trees, fasting on holy days, and listening to the stories of the epics recited by traveling bards. Artisans and craftsmen formed the economic backbone of many villages. The potter spun his wheel with rhythmic grace, shaping clay into vessels both sacred and mundane. The blacksmith stoked his furnace to forge tools, plowshares, and arrowheads. The weaver threaded cotton into cloth dyed with indigo or turmeric. These goods were bartered locally or sent to nearby towns. where merchants sold them in bustling bazaars. Trade routes connected even remote villages to a wider world. A caravan might pass through bearing salt, spices, or sandalwood. A message from the king's tax collector could arrive, requesting grain or coin, and every so often a monk or wandering teacher might appear, bringing news from distant lands and teachings of dharma, karma, and liberation. Despite the rhythms of routine, life in a Gupta village was not untouched by challenge. Droughts could ruin crops. Illnesses, especially fever, injury, or infection, were difficult to treat despite local remedies. Bandits might threaten travelers. Political upheaval in distant capitals could disrupt peace, and yet resilience remained the defining trait of these rural communities. Through shared labor, inherited wisdom, and the slow, steady cycles of the seasons, the village endured. In many ways, these villages were the hidden pillars of the Gupta Empire. While kings issued edicts and poets wrote verses, it was the farmers who grew the rice, the artisans who shaped the vessels, the mothers who wove cotton and passed down songs. It was here, in the simplicity of daily life, that the deeper identity of Gupta India was formed, not grand, but grounded. And so, as you drift now into sleep, let us leave behind the court and walk instead through a village bathed in starlight. A mother hums a lullaby beside a resting child. A potter's wheel spins down to stillness. From a distant temple comes the fading sound of a conch shell calling the night to peace. As the sun crests over the eastern horizon, its golden light spills slowly across the fields, temples, and riverbanks of the Gupta realm, awakening a world not just of labor and learning, but of deep spiritual longing. Each bell that chimes, each incense stick lit at a home altar, each whispered mantra drifting into morning air, these are not merely rituals, but threads in a grand tapestry of faith. In the Gupta Empire, religion was not confined to stone sanctuaries or royal decrees. It was part of the breath and rhythm of daily life. Tonight, we walk gently into that world of faith, plural and peaceful, radiant and rich, and explore how devotion shaped the Gupta era's spirit, art, and identity. Religion in Gupta India was not a monolith. Instead, it was a dynamic blend of traditions, each flourishing alongside the others in relative harmony. While Hinduism rose in prominence, particularly through Vaishnavism and Shaivism, Buddhism and Jainism remained vibrant and respected. This period marked not conflict, but cultural cross-pollination, where monks, priests, and sages shared the same cities and sometimes even the same audiences. Royal patronage often flowed to multiple sects, and temples of different traditions could be found standing within walking distance of one another, each resonating with chants, offerings, and silent prayers. Among the most prominent religious developments during this period was the ascendancy of Hindu devotionalism, especially the worship of Vishnu and Shiva. Temples dedicated to these deities became increasingly elaborate and central to community life. Vishnu, the preserver of the universe, was depicted in calm majesty's four arms, holding the conch, discus, lotus, and mace. Shiva, the ascetic lord and cosmic dancer, was often honored in the form of the lingam, a symbolic representation of divine energy. These gods were no longer remote Vedic forces, but intimate, approachable beings who heard the prayers of ordinary people and accepted their offerings with compassion. The rise of bhakti or devotional worship transformed the religious experience. Faith was no longer only about sacrifice or ritual precision. It was now about personal connection, emotional surrender, and inner transformation. A peasant could bow before a village shrine and feel as spiritually fulfilled as a Brahmin chanting Vedic hymns in a grand temple. Devotees composed hymns and songs, some of which would later evolve into entire bhakti movements across India. Even within the palaces of kings, priests were no longer just ritualists. They were spiritual counselors, guiding rulers on paths of ethical governance and self-realization. At the same time, Buddhism remained a powerful force, especially in the eastern parts of the empire, where universities like Nalanda supported vibrant monastic communities. Buddhism, in the Gupta Age, was primarily Mahayana in character, emphasizing compassion, the bodhisattva ideal, and the pursuit of enlightenment for all beings. Monks wore saffron robes, shaved their heads, and traveled widely, teaching the Dharma to villagers and nobles alike. Buddhist art flourished in stone carvings and bronze statues, delicate, serene, and filled with symbolic meaning. Gupta rulers, though mostly Hindu by practice, continued to support Buddhist institutions. Land grants were issued to monasteries, Buddhist pilgrims were welcomed, and relics were enshrined with reverence. This religious pluralism was not merely tolerance, it was integration. In Gupta sculpture and literature, one often finds motifs from multiple traditions coexisting peacefully. A temple wall might bear images of Vishnu, Buddha, and Jain Tirthankars side by side, without contradiction. The empire, it seemed, understood that truth could wear many faces. Jainism, too, maintained a quiet yet enduring presence, especially in western and southern regions of the subcontinent. Jain monks, known for their asceticism and devotion to nonviolence, walked barefoot from village to village, teaching the path of liberation through right conduct, knowledge, and faith. Temples carved into rocky hillsides offered spaces for contemplation, and Jain texts in Prakrit and Sanskrit were copied and preserved. Though smaller in number, the Jain community contributed significantly to the ethical discourse of the time, emphasizing discipline, restraint, and the sanctity of all life. One of the most profound features of Gupta religiosity was its integration into the rhythms of life. Religion wasn't limited to specific times or places. It infused everything. Every home had a sacred space. Every act, teaming, farming, marrying, giving birth, was guided by ritual. Auspicious days were chosen for travel. Children were named in ceremonies, invoking blessings from the gods. Even architecture followed sacred geometry, aligning structures with cosmic principles laid out in texts like the Vastu Shastra. The world itself was seen as divine, layered with energies and meanings far beyond the visible. Ritual and myth were also woven into storytelling and art. The Ramayana and Mahabharata, already ancient, were retold in new forms through temple carvings, dance performances, and poetic verse. The Gupta period was not merely a time of faith, but of religious imagination. Epics were not static texts, they were living traditions. Wandering bards recited episodes in village squares, using musical instruments to dramatize battles and romances. In the cities, court poets reinterpreted these epics with fresh symbolism and ornate language, crafting them anew for elite audiences. Everyone, from peasant to prince, knew these stories. They were shared inheritance, sacred and familiar. Amidst all this, the role of women in religious life deserves gentle attention. While formal priestly roles remained mostly male-dominated, women were active participants in household rituals, temple offerings, and devotional song. In certain sects, they also served as teachers, healers, and even saints. Goddesses like Durga, Lakshmi, and Saraswati were deeply venerated, their qualities extolled in hymns and visualized in sculpture. In these divine figures, women found both spiritual icons and cultural affirmation. Festivals honoring female deities, such as Navaratri, were marked by dance, fasting, and shared prayer, recognition of the feminine as sacred power. This syncretic spiritual world was not without its tensions, rivalries between sects, debates over doctrine, and the slow hardening of caste boundaries would shape the centuries to come. But in the Gupta Age, the prevailing tone was one of interconnectedness. There was room for meditation and mythology, for logic and longing, for gods with many names and truths told in many tongues. Faith was not confined, it was expansive. It flowed like the Ganges, sometimes calm, sometimes strong, but always nourishing the land it touched. As we step out of this world of flickering oil lamps and temple chants, imagine the quiet of evening descending on a Gupta village. A mother offers rice and flowers at the household shrine. A group of children listen to a wandering monk recount the story of the Buddha's first sermon. From a distant hilltop, the last sound of the conch echoes through the twilight. In the fading light, everything seems held together by something unseen, a web of belief, as soft as breath and as enduring as stone. In the soft hours before sunrise, when the stars still linger and the world has not yet stirred, a solitary figure sits beneath a lamp, his eyes fixed on numbers traced in dust with a wooden stylus. Around him, silence reigns, broken only by the quiet scratching of symbols and the occasional flutter of a palm leaf page. It is a silence filled with thought, a silence in which equations are born and the boundaries of knowledge are stretched. This is not a king or a warrior, not a poet or a priest. This is a scholar, a mathematician, a seeker of patterns hidden deep in the heart of reality. And in the Gupta Empire, he was not alone. The Gupta period was not only a golden age of literature, art, and governance, it was also a renaissance of science and mathematics. Here, in a civilization that honored both the sacred and the rational, numbers were more than tools for trade or architecture. They were keys to the cosmos. In this chapter, we journey into the mathematical mind of ancient India, where decimals whispered truths, geometry found beauty in circles, and a single-digit zero would change the world forever. Among the most extraordinary minds of this age was Aryabhata, born in 476 CE, near the close of the Gupta dynasty's most radiant years. Though his life remains partially veiled by time, we know that he studied and taught at Kusumapura, believed to be part of Pataliputra. It was here that he composed his most famous work, the Aryabhasya, compact yet profound treatise that covered arithmetic, algebra, plane and spherical trigonometry, and planetary motions. Written in Sanskrit verse, the Aryabhasya was as poetic as it was precise, a reminder that in Gupta India, even numbers could sing. One of Aryabhata's most revolutionary contributions was his formal use of zero and the place value system. While earlier Indian mathematicians had hinted at such ideas, Aryabhata helped articulate and apply them with clarity. He used a system in which the position of a digit determined its value units, tens, hundreds, and so on. This concept, so intuitive to us today, was a radical departure from the numeric systems of the Greeks and Romans, which relied on additive symbols. The zero, not yet represented by a symbol, but clearly understood as a placeholder, allowed for unimaginable efficiency in calculation. It is difficult to overstate how transformative this idea was. Without zero, mathematics stalls at basic arithmetic. With it, whole new worlds open: algebra, calculus, computer science. And it was in Gupta India that this seed was planted, nurtured not by conquest or economy, but by pure intellectual curiosity. The concept of nothingness, which in philosophy was the path to liberation, here became a tool to unlock infinity. Aryabhata's brilliance didn't end with numerals. He explored the properties of pi, calculating it as 3.1416, astonishingly accurate for his time, and even acknowledged its irrational nature. He introduced sine tables, which allowed for precise trigonometric calculations. And perhaps most impressively, he proposed that the Earth rotates on its axis, centuries before such ideas would gain acceptance in Europe. This was not guesswork. Aryabhata reached these conclusions through careful observation, reasoning, and mathematical modeling, a scientific method in its earliest flowering. But Aryabhata was not alone. Other mathematicians and astronomers, such as Varahamihira, carried forward this legacy. In his Brihat Samhita, Varahamihira compiled knowledge on astronomy, weather prediction, architecture, and even dream interpretation. He worked with planetary conjunctions, developed calendars, and emphasized the interconnectedness of natural phenomena. For these thinkers, the stars and seasons were not distant curiosities. They were part of an ordered cosmos, a divine geometry waiting to be understood. Mathematics during this era was not taught in isolation. It was deeply embedded in other fields: astronomy, engineering, music, art, and ritual practice. Temples were designed according to precise measurements, aligned with celestial bodies. Musical scales were explored mathematically, their patterns revealing hidden harmonies. Even religious rituals required exact timing, calculated with attention to lunar cycles and solar declinations. In the Gupta worldview, to measure well was to live in harmony with the universe. The tools of these mathematicians were simple sand trays, styluses, oral recitation, mnemonic verses, yet their insights rivaled those of future generations with telescopes and charts. Knowledge was preserved through memorized verses and teacher-student transmission, ensuring continuity without dependency on fragile texts. When palm leaf manuscripts were used, they were copied meticulously, often accompanied by illustrations and commentaries to aid understanding. What's most remarkable is how conceptual and abstract Gupta mathematics could be. Unlike the Greeks, who often grounded their calculations in geometry, Indian scholars were comfortable with symbols, unknown variables, and theoretical constructs. They didn't just want to measure the world, they wanted to understand the principles beneath it. Infinity wasn't just a poetic idea, it was a mathematical reality, explored through series and limits, long before calculus would formally define such things. These intellectual pursuits were not confined to cloistered scholars. In the bustling cities of the Gupta Empire, astrologers calculated horoscopes for merchants and kings. Engineers designed irrigation systems and city layouts with geometric precision. Even village priests used arithmetic to determine festival dates and temple alignments. Mathematics was woven into daily life, seen not as abstract, but as practical and sacred. And yet there was humility in this knowledge. The sages of this era did not claim to master the universe. Rather, they sought to glimpse its underlying order, to live in alignment with it. In this way, mathematics became a form of meditation, a pathway, not just to understanding, but to peace, Tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine Aryabhata seated beneath a canopy of stars, scratching numbers into dust by lamplight, his mind reaching past what is seen toward what is true. Picture the quiet halls where students chant formulas in unison, their voices rising like a mantra. Envision the rhythm of numbers echoing through temples, courts, and fields of silent music that shaped the Gupta Golden Age from within. As twilight descends over the northern plains and the embers of village hearths flicker against the night, the world grows still. But far beyond these quiet fields, along dusty roads and winding mountain passes, the pulse of commerce continues. In the soft jangle of camel bells, the creak of wagon wheels, and the rustle of silk unrolled for a curious buyer, the story of the Gupta Empire's wealth unfolds not in royal decrees or grand monuments, but in the whispers of trade and the gleam of gold coins passed hand to hand. Tonight, we walk those ancient roads, tracing the threads of connection that wove the Gupta world into a broader web of global exchange. The Gupta Empire was ideally situated for trade, with fertile heartlands between the Ganges and Yamuna rivers, and access to both the northern trade routes and the coastal ports of Bengal and Gujarat. The empire became a hub for overland and maritime commerce. Traders traveled from the Arabian Peninsula, the Roman world, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia, converging at Gupta cities to exchange goods, ideas, and stories. And just as the Guptas benefited from this traffic of treasure, they shaped it, establishing a political and economic climate stable enough to invite prosperity. One of the great arteries of this commercial lifeblood was the Silk Road, the ancient network of land routes that stretched from China to the Mediterranean. Though much of the Silk Road's glamour is tied to Central Asia and Persia, India played a crucial role as both a destination and intermediary. Gupta merchants traded in silk, spices, ivory, pearls, gemstones, perfumes, dyes, and cotton textiles goods that were prized across Asia and beyond. In return, they received horses, gold, glassware, wine, and luxury goods from far-off lands. Alongside the land routes, maritime trade flourished, particularly through the ports of the eastern coast, such as Tamralipti. These bustling harbors connected Gupta India to Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Southeast Asia, and even the distant kingdoms of China and the Roman Empire. Ships laden with cloth, incense, and sandalwood sailed across the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea, guided by the monsoon winds. In these ports, languages blended, foreign coins changed hands, and cultural contact became a daily experience. The Guptas facilitated this exchange not just with infrastructure, but with trust. Roads were maintained and patrolled. Rest houses and way stations offered shelter. Markets were regulated, weights and measures standardized. Taxation existed, but it was reasonable and predictable. The empire issued clear land grants and merchant charters, fostering confidence among guilds and traveling traders. It was a system that encouraged long-distance travel, investment, and most importantly movement of wealth without fear. At the heart of Gupta economic identity was their coinage, a gleaming testament to both artistic refinement and political control. The Gupta gold coins, known as dinars, are among the most beautiful in Indian history. Struck with astonishing detail, they featured portraits of emperors, divine symbols, and inscriptions in elegant Sanskrit. Each coin was more than a medium of exchange, was a message of strength, stability, and divine favor. One might find a coin depicting Samudragupta, playing the veena, his fingers delicately strumming the strings, signaling not just his love of music, but the peaceful prosperity of his reign. Another might show a king performing the Ashvamedha, the horse sacrifice, asserting both ritual power and military dominion. These coins traveled far across the subcontinent and into foreign lands, carrying the Gupta image abroad as surely as an ambassador would. But wealth in the Gupta era was not hoarded only by kings. A thriving merchant class emerged, especially in cities like Ujjain, Pataliputra, Mathura, and Varanasi. These were not just trading centers, but cosmopolitan melting pots, where artisans, bankers, jewelers, and caravan leaders negotiated the ebb and flow of economic life. Merchants often belonged to powerful guilds, known as shrinis, which managed trade networks, set prices, enforced ethical conduct, and even acted as financiers or lenders for large ventures. These guilds also supported religious and civic life, funding the construction of temples, stupas, and public works. Inscriptions from the period show merchant guilds endowing hospitals, commissioning sculptures, and funding Sanskrit schools. They were not merely businessmen, they were community leaders, rooted in both dharma and commerce. Their wealth was a source of prestige, but also of responsibility. Markets were vibrant and diverse, offering goods from every corner of the empire and beyond. One could stroll through a bazaar lined with dyed textiles, fine pottery, intricate jewelry, aromatic spices, and handcrafted tools. Sellers called out in a cacophony of dialects, from Prakrit to Sanskrit, Tamil to Persian. Coins clinked in pouches. Bargaining was a ritual in itself, and all of it pulsed with the confidence of a stable, expanding economy, anchored by agriculture, elevated by trade, and enriched by cultural exchange. The impact of Gupta trade wasn't just economic, it was intellectual and artistic. Foreign scholars came to study at Nalanda and other institutions, carrying Indian mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and literature back to their homelands. Meanwhile, Indian art and religious iconography traveled eastward, influencing the architecture and sculpture of Cambodia, Java, and even China. Gupta India was not merely importing goods, it was exporting ideas. Even in the countryside, traces of this prosperity reached the lives of ordinary people. A successful harvest could now be traded for goods from across the empire. Tools improved. Coinage made savings possible. Religious festivals were funded with greater splendor, and the wealth circulating in cities trickled outwards, supporting the livelihoods of potters, weavers, blacksmiths, and farmers alike. While not every village saw dramatic change, the broad ripple of Gupta commerce brought with it a rising tide of opportunity. And yet there remained a gentleness in the Gupta approach to wealth. Unlike the frantic accumulation seen in later empires, Gupta prosperity was marked by balance. Dharmarachous living guided not just the individual, but the economy itself. Generosity was praised, ethical conduct was expected, and while luxury existed, it was often paired with philosophical moderation. Wealth was a blessing, yes, but one to be used wisely and shared freely. As you settle deeper into sleep, let us walk one last time through a Gupta marketplace at twilight. The stalls are closing. A merchant counts his coins beneath a flickering lamp. A caravan readies for tomorrow's journey. Somewhere in the distance, a veena is played in a courtyard, its notes floating gently into the night. And in the folds of silk, in the curve of a coin, in the slow movement of stars overhead, we Hear the soft echoes of a world connected not just by trade, but by trust. As the first light of morning filters through a lattice window, casting soft shadows upon cool stone floors, we find ourselves not in a palace or temple, but in a quiet atelier, where the true soul of the Gupta era was carved not with words or coins, but with chisels and brushes, pigment and devotion. In this chapter, we awaken to the world of Gupta art and sculpture, a realm where the divine was made visible, the human form was honored in stone, and silence was transformed into form and grace. The Gupta age is often called India's classical age, not only for its achievements in governance and learning, but for its unique and enduring artistic sensibility. In Gupta art, one encounters a profound sense of balance, a harmony between spiritual depth and physical beauty, symbolism and realism, transcendence and earthly presence. It was during this time that the Indian artistic canon reached a point of elegant clarity. Human forms became serene and supple. Divine figures, once fierce and overwhelming, grew gentler and more approachable. Proportions were idealized but never rigid, gestures expressive but never exaggerated. Much of this refinement stemmed from the philosophical and aesthetic ideals that shaped the era. In Gupta sculpture, the goal was not to replicate physical reality, but to express the essence of the subject, its divinity, virtue, or spiritual energy. Artists followed principles laid out in the ancient Shilpa Shastra, a treatise on art and iconography, which detailed ideal proportions, symbolic gestures, postures, and the spiritual significance of every detail, from facial expressions to the placement of the eyes. The result was not just beauty, but reverent representation. One of the finest examples of Gupta artistry can be found in the sculptures of Sarnath near Varanasi. It was here, at the site of the Buddha's first sermon, that a series of sandstone images were carved that would forever shape the visual language of Buddhism. The most famous among them is the seated Buddha in Dharmachakra mudra, or gesture of teaching. With a calm smile, downcast eyes, and hands poised in symbolic precision, the figure embodies inner peace and cosmic wisdom. The robes cling to the body in fluid, near translucent folds, suggesting both stillness and movement. Around him, a halo glows, carved with floral motifs and celestial beings. This image, simple yet profound, became a template for Buddhist art across Asia. Its elegance traveled with monks and artisans to China, Southeast Asia, and Japan, shaping regional traditions for centuries. The Gupta aesthetic, especially in Buddhist sculpture, was admired for its gentle spirituality, its ability to evoke sacred presence through understatement rather than spectacle. It marked a turning point in Asian religious art, one of grace, restraint, and clarity. Hindu sculpture, too, flourished during this era. Temples dedicated to Vishnu, Shiva, and the goddess rose in cities and villages, their walls adorned with intricate carvings. Unlike earlier periods, where gods appeared fierce and unapproachable, Gupta artists portrayed deities with human tenderness and divine majesty. Vishnu appeared in his various avatars, calm, balanced, beneficent. Shiva, the great yogi, was depicted in serene meditation, or as Nataraja, the cosmic dancer whose rhythm sustains the universe. The goddess Durga stood poised in mid-battle, powerful but composed, her many arms a dance of protection and destruction. One remarkable example is the Dashavatara temple at Diagar, often cited as the earliest surviving Hindu stone temple in North India. Its sculptural panels narrate stories from the Purana mythic tales of gods and heroes. One famous relief depicts Vishnu reclining on the serpent Ananta, dreaming the universe into being. Around him, attendants, sages, and cosmic symbols unfold in perfect harmony, each figure distinct yet part of a unified whole. The composition speaks to a cosmic order, lovingly carved in stone, where every being has its place and purpose. Gupta art also extended beyond the divine. Portrait sculptures of kings and donors appeared in temples and shrines, often shown in prayer or offering gifts. Terracotta figurines used in homes, festivals, or as votive offerings depicted dancers, musicians, animals, and scenes of daily life. These humble pieces, often unglazed and unpainted, reveal a world of affection and charm. A mother cradling a child, a monkey scratching its head, a farmer carrying a yoke. In these small details, the human touch of Gupta India is preserved, intimate, earthy, and deeply relatable. Perhaps no site captures the full artistic vision of the Gupta period better than the Ajanta caves, though their construction began earlier and continued into later centuries. Nestled in a horseshoe-shaped gorge in Maharashtra, these rock-cut caves served as Buddhist monasteries and meditation halls, carved directly into the cliff face. During the Gupta period, they reached new heights of beauty, especially in their murals paintings that have survived more than a millennium in the cool darkness of the caves. The Ajanta murals are among the greatest achievements of Indian art, painted in natural pigments on dry plaster. They depict scenes from the Jataka tale stories of the Buddha's past lives, as well as portraits of royal patrons, celestial beings, and processions of monks and dancers. The colors are vivid, deep reds, cool blues, golden ochres, and forest greens. The brushwork is delicate, the lines fluid. Faces are expressive, bodies poised in dynamic motion. The narrative unfolds across walls and ceilings in continuous rhythm, guiding the viewer not just through space, but through time and story. One of the most famous paintings shows the Bodhisattva Padmapani, a compassionate figure adorned with jewels and a gentle gaze. In one hand, he holds a blue lotus. Around him are attendants, animals, and worshippers, all rendered with stunning realism and emotional depth. Despite the grandeur, the mood is contemplative. In the hush of the cave, the painting becomes a meditation of visual mantra, whispered in color and line. What set Gupta art apart was not merely its technical skill, but its aesthetic philosophy. Artists sought to depict not just how things looked, but what they meant. A curve of the lip could express divine joy, a tilted head, quiet compassion. The human body, idealized yet natural, became a vehicle for spiritual symbolism. Beauty was not superficial. It was a reflection of deeper truths. To create art was to participate in cosmic order, to mirror the balance and grace of the universe. As we step gently out of this world of stone and pigment, let us pause in a temple courtyard at dusk. The carvings glow in the fading sunlight. A priest lights lamps, their flames dancing in rhythm with the shadows on the walls. Nearby, a sculptor sharpens his chisel for tomorrow's work, his heart full of purpose. In this moment, time seems suspended. The past breathes through art. The sacred lives in form. In the calm of early morning, when the air is damp with dew and birds call softly across open courtyards, a quiet figure moves through a village street, carrying a satchel of herbs and a scroll of Sanskrit verses. He is no merchant, no monk, and no official of the empire. He is a Vaidya healer, a physician, a keeper of ancient knowledge. In the Gupta Empire, where temples and courts flourished, so too did another world, one of healing hands, herbal wisdom, and the age-old science of Ayurveda. The word Ayurveda comes from the Sanskrit ayas and Veda, literally the science of life. More than just a system of medicine, Ayurveda was a comprehensive philosophy of health, seeking harmony between the body, mind, and spirit. During the Gupta period, this tradition saw significant refinement and widespread application. Physicians, both lay and monastic, studied classical texts, applied complex treatments, and operated within a society that regarded well-being as a sacred duty, not a luxury. At the heart of Ayurvedic practice were the three doshas, Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. These were not physical substances, but elemental energies governing bodily processes. Vata, associated with air and space, controlled movement and the nervous system. Pitta, linked to fire and water, governed digestion, metabolism, and vision. Kapha, rooted in earth and water, regulated structure, immunity, and fluid balance. Health was defined as the equilibrium of these forces, while illness arose from their disturbance. Diagnosis involved identifying which dosha was out of balance and tailoring treatment accordingly. Treatments were varied and nuanced. They included dietary regulation, herbal remedies, oil massages, steam therapy, fasting, and yoga-based breathing techniques. Panchakarma, or the five-fold purification process, was used to cleanse the body of toxins. Formulas were drawn from an immense pharmacopoeia of plants, minerals, and animal products. Each herb neem, tulsi, ashwagandha, turmeric had specific properties, prepared and administered with meticulous care. Remedies were individualized, reflecting the belief that every person was a unique combination of constitution, lifestyle, and environment. This knowledge was not new to the Gupta period. Texts like the Charaka Samhita and Sushruta Samhita, composed centuries earlier, formed the backbone of Ayurvedic education. But during the Gupta age, these texts were systematized, taught, and applied with new vigor. The Charaka Samhita emphasized internal medicine, diagnostics, and patient care, while the Sushruta Samhita delved into surgery, trauma management, and even cosmetic procedures. It described techniques for suturing, bone setting, cataract removal, and the reconstruction of noses procedures, astonishing in their complexity and precision. Education in the healing arts was rigorous. Young students lived with their teachers, learning not just from books, but from observation and practice. They memorized Sanskrit verses describing symptoms, anatomy, treatments, and ethical conduct. A physician was expected to be more than a technician. He was a moral guide, bound by vows of nonviolence, honesty, and service. The Hippocratic Oath may be Western, but its spirit found deep resonance in India's Ayurvedic ethics. Medical centers, though less institutional than modern hospitals, existed in both cities and monastic complexes. Some were attached to temples, where patients received both spiritual and physical care. Others were run by royal patronage or merchant donations. They served not just the elite, but the common people, farmers, artisans, travelers, and monks. The system was community-based and preventive in spirit, emphasizing healthy living, seasonal routines, and emotional well-being as core elements of health. The Gupta court took a keen interest in medicine. Inscriptions from the period mention grants to physicians, funding for dispensaries, and support for scholarly translations. Medical texts were copied and preserved in libraries, alongside works of mathematics and astronomy. Physicians were respected members of society, often consulted not only for illness, but for guidance on fertility, longevity, and ritual cleanliness. They advised kings and generals, cared for pregnant women, treated battlefield injuries, and oversaw temple hygiene. Ayurveda was not limited to the human body. Veterinary science, known as Pashu Ayurveda, also flourished. Livestock, so vital to the economy, were cared for with great attention. Separate manuals outlined treatments for horses, cows, and elephants. Elephant caretakers, mahouts, were especially trained in recognizing signs of stress or disease in these regal animals, who often served in royal processions and war. Parallel to Ayurveda was the rise of alchemy and early chemistry, particularly in the context of medicine. Scholars explored the properties of metals and minerals, seeking both healing substances and spiritual transformation. Mercury, gold, and arsenic were studied in detail, sometimes used in microdoses as medicine. Alchemical texts such as Rasaratnakara began to circulate, blending medicine with mysticism and experimentation. These pursuits laid foundations for future advancements in chemistry and pharmacology in South Asia. Women, while often absent from formal records, played a vital role in the healing arts. Midwives guided births with herbal tonics and gentle massage. Mothers taught daughters the properties of plants. Grandmothers prepared salves and poultices, applying knowledge passed down orally for generations. These informal healers provided continuity and care in every household, their work grounded in intuition, tradition, and quiet skill. As the empire expanded, Ayurvedic knowledge traveled with it. Indian healers were welcomed in foreign courts, and texts were translated into Tibetan, Arabic, and Chinese. Buddhist monks carried medical teachings along with scriptures, establishing a tradition of integrated healing and compassion. Gupta India became not just a source of luxury goods, but of medical wisdom shared across borders in the spirit of service. As we leave this world of herbs, scrolls, and quiet diagnosis, picture a small clinic in a Gupta town at dusk. A physician prepares a bitter decoction for a coughing child. A young apprentice sweeps the floor, careful not to disturb the scrolls. Outside, an old man receives an oil massage by the fire, murmuring thanks. There is no rush, no panic. Healing here is ritual, rhythm, and Kara slow return to balance. And now, as you rest, let the fragrance of neem and sandalwood drift into your dreams. Feel the quiet hands of a healer on your brow. Know that you are part of a lineage that honored the body, nurtured the soul, and believed that with time, warmth, and wisdom, even the deepest pain could be eased. Sleep gently in the arms of an ancient science, where life itself was the greatest medicine. The golden light of late afternoon glints off palace domes and temple spires as the city of Ujjain stirs with calm contentment. Courtiers stroll through manicured gardens, their silken robes fluttering in the breeze. Musicians tune their veenas in shaded verandas. A merchant counts gleaming gold diners beside rolls of silk and bundles of sandalwood. The bustle of empire hums beneath a canopy of peace. At the heart of it all sits Chandragupta II, the son of Samudragupta, a ruler whose reign marked the very height of the Gupta Golden Age. Chandragupta II, also known by the honorific Vikramaditya, was not merely a successor. He was the culmination of Gupta ambition, diplomacy, and cultural refinement. His name would come to symbolize ideal kingship in Indian lore, a sovereign who ruled with justice, patronized the arts, defended the realm, and fostered prosperity without cruelty. If Samudragupta expanded the empire with military prowess, Chandragupta II cemented its legacy with stability, elegance, and peace. He ascended the throne sometime around 375 CE, inheriting an empire already shaped by his father's conquests. But unlike his predecessors, Chandragupta II focused less on warfare and more on consolidation, governance, and diplomacy. His marriage alliances, most notably with the Vakataka dynasty, strengthened political ties in the Deccan, while his administrative acumen ensured that the Gupta realm functioned smoothly. His reign was not devoid of conflict. He famously defeated the Shaka rulers in western India, but these campaigns were precise, strategic, and aimed at securing trade routes and territory, not endless expansion. One of his most significant accomplishments was the annexation of Gujarat and Malwa, including the critical port city of Baruch. With this, the Guptas gained access to the Arabian Sea and took control of vital maritime trade. The empire now had its hands not only on the fertile heartland of northern India, but also on the pulse of international commerce. Goods flowed in from Persia, the Roman Empire, and Southeast Asia, precious gems, spices, textiles, and incense. In turn, Indian art, mathematics, and religious ideas traveled outward, carried by merchants, monks, and sailors. Chandragupta II made Ujjain, rather than Pataliputra, his primary seat of power. This city, already a center of trade and learning, blossomed under his patronage. Nestled along the Shipra River, Ujjain was sacred to both Shiva and Vishnu, and revered as one of the 7 holy cities of Hinduism. Under Gupta rule, it became a true cosmopolitan capital, a crossroads of poets and scholars, astrologers and artisans, Brahmins and Buddhists. It offered a model of what Gupta civilization aspired to be: prosperous, pluralistic, and poised. It was in this shining court that Chandragupta II is said to have gathered the legendary Navaratnas, or 9 gems, a council of scholars and artists whose wisdom illuminated every facet of culture. Though the historical accuracy of this exact grouping is debated, the idea itself reflects the Gupta emphasis on intellectual and artistic excellence. Among these luminaries was Kalidasa, the poet whose verses we explored earlier. Alongside him might have stood astronomers, linguists, rhetoricians, and philosophers, each a master in their field. Each granted respect and freedom under a king who understood the value of the mind. Chandragupta II's reign also left its mark on coinage and inscriptions. His gold coins continued the Gupta tradition of artistic precision, depicting him as a heroic archer, a horseback warrior, or a regal monarch performing sacrifices. The famous iron pillar of Marali, near Delhi, bears an inscription in Sanskrit that many scholars associate with his reign. This towering pillar, known for its mysterious resistance to rust, is a testament not only to Gupta metallurgy, but to the imperial vision of eternal strength and spiritual righteousness. What truly defined his era, however, was not conquest or construction, but peace. The Gupta realm under Chandragupta II was remarkably stable, a rarity in a world often fragmented by succession struggles and border skirmishes. Roads were safe, trade routes protected, harvests plentiful. Farmers tilled their land with confidence. Artisans found steady markets for their goods. Students studied uninterrupted, and pilgrims traveled freely to sacred sites. Even neighboring kingdoms recognized the strength and fairness of Gupta rule, choosing tribute and alliance over resistance. Religion during his reign continued to flourish in pluralistic harmony. Though Chandragupta II was a devout Vaishnavite, temples to Shiva, Devi, and Buddhist stupas received equal care. Jain communities thrived, particularly in western India. Religious festivals were celebrated with pomp and joy, often supported by royal grants. Inscriptions from the period show a king deeply involved in public works, endowing temples, commissioning sculptures, and supporting Brahmins and monks alike. As night falls across the empire, imagine the glow of oil lamps lining the streets of Ujjain. In a temple courtyard, a priest recites Sanskrit verses beneath a painted ceiling. In the palace, the king listens as Kalidasa reads a new stanza under the stars. Merchants tally their earnings. Children fall asleep to tales of Ram and Krishna. And above all this, the empire breathes in peace, not the silence of suppression, but the stillness of a civilization in balance with itself. As dawn's first rays stretch across the open courtyards of temples and the silent symmetry of palace columns, they strike something unexpected, cold, dark, smooth, and unyielding. Rising more than 20 feet into the sky, crowned with a bell-shaped capital and inscribed with Sanskrit verse, stands an object that has defied both time and nature. In the quiet hush of Delhi's Murali, long after the emperors have faded into legend, the iron pillar still stands, weathered by the elements, but untouched by rust. Tonight, we turn our gaze to this enduring marvel, and through it, explore the deeper metaphors of permanence and resilience that defined the Gupta spirit. The iron pillar, standing in the Kutpi complex today, dates back to the Gupta period, and many scholars attribute its construction to the reign of Chandragupta II. Around the 4th century CE, while debates linger over its exact origin and intended location, the inscription carved into its surface is more revealing. Written in elegant Sanskrit using the Gupta script, it praises a king named Chandra, widely believed to be Chandragupta II, describes his victories in battle and his devotion to Vishnu. Though the details are formal and stylized, the tone is unmistakable. This pillar is a monument to imperial virtue, both in physical form and in symbolic intent. What makes the iron pillar truly extraordinary is not merely its age or the poetry etched into its flank, but its scientific wonder. Composed of 98% pure wrought iron and weighing over 6 tons, the pillar has stood outdoors for over 1,600 years without significant corrosion. Modern metallurgists have marveled at its preservation, citing a protective layer of iron hydrogen phosphate that formed naturally over centuries. But even with today's technology, reproducing its composition and durability without advanced alloying techniques is a formidable challenge. In a world obsessed with innovation, the pillar whispers of ancient mastery, humble yet profound. To the people of Gupta India, however, the pillar likely held more spiritual significance than metallurgical curiosity. Positioned originally in a temple courtyard, it may have served as a flagstaff, a daba, associated with Vishnu or the Garuda, emblem symbols of divine sovereignty and cosmic order, just as the mountain Meru anchored the universe in Hindu cosmology. So too did this pillar anchor the king's dharma, his righteousness, his balance between earthly power and sacred responsibility. It was not only a feat of engineering, it was a symbol of eternal strength, forged not only from iron, but from intention. The very act of placing such a pillar at a sacred site reflects the integration of science, art, and spirituality that characterized the Gupta era. Unlike monuments built purely to impress or intimidate, the iron pillar possesses a quiet dignity. Its surface is undecorated, save for its inscription. Its form is slender, almost modest, and yet, in its persistence, it has become a message that transcends language, that greatness lies not in noise, but in endurance. It is a relic of a time when kings thought not only in terms of years, but of cosmic cycles, when actions were weighed against eternity. The inscription itself offers a glimpse into Gupta ideals. It describes the king's victories in the Vanga countries, likely referring to Bengal and his defeat of a confederation of enemies. But rather than glorifying bloodshed, the tone is restrained. The emphasis lies not on destruction, but on restoration, on bringing peace, supporting religion, and honoring the gods. In this way, the pillar doesn't just celebrate triumph, it affirms a model of kingship rooted in protection, piety, and humility before the divine. And this, perhaps, is the true brilliance of the Gupta age. While empires before and after would rise through violence, the Guptas sought to temper power with wisdom. Their greatest symbols, poems, temples, astronomical tables, and yes, even a simple iron shaft, did not shout, they endured. The iron pillar stands today not as a boast, but as a promise that knowledge, integrity, and balance can leave traces longer lasting than gold or war. Over time, the pillar would attract legends. Centuries later, Persian and Mughal chroniclers would marvel at its resistance to rust. British scholars in the 19th century would study its composition and proclaim it a marvel of pre-industrial metallurgy. Even today, tourists reach out to touch its surface, drawn by the texture of something that has outlived empires. It has been reinterpreted, recontextualized, and reframed, but never forgotten. In many ways, the iron pillar reflects the philosophy of impermanence and permanence that echoed through Gupta India. Stone temples might crumble, political borders might shift, but Dharma, knowledge, and the pursuit of harmony, these were meant to stand firm. The pillar was not just a marker of victory, it was a prayer in metal, for the endurance of truth, for the stability of rule, for the sanctity of civilization. As night falls once more, imagine walking barefoot through the courtyard of that ancient temple, moonlight bathing the ground in silver. Before you, the iron pillar rises in quiet majesty, its surface cool and unyielding to the touch. Around you, the city slumbers, unaware that this artifact will outlast them all. And above, the stars keep their watch, silent witnesses to a world that once believed deeply in the strength of virtue and the power of peace. As the soft pinks of dawn spill over the tiled rooftops and terraced gardens of a Gupta town, the day begins not with fanfare, but with the rustling of saras, the gentle swish of water being poured at shrines, and the lull of lullabies whispered in courtyards. In this serene and ordered world, a quiet power moves through its homes, temples, and markets. She stirs the pot, recites the prayer, weaves the cloth, and writes the verse. Tonight, we turn our attention to the lives of women in the Gupta Empire, whose presence, though often obscured in formal history, was essential, complex, and deeply woven into the cultural fabric of the Golden Age. Inscriptions, literature, and sculpture from the Gupta period provide tantalizing glimpses into the status and roles of women. While the age was still predominantly patriarchal property, political power and priesthoods remained largely male domains. Women were far from invisible. They were educators, poets, performers, merchants, and spiritual practitioners. Some were queens and patrons of the arts. Others were midwives, craftswomen, or village matriarchs. In nearly every sphere, their influence, though often indirect, was foundational. Within the household, women held central authority over domestic affairs. The home was considered a sacred space, and the woman of the house, or grehini, was its keeper and spiritual guide. She conducted daily rituals, taught children their first lessons, maintained seasonal festivals, and managed food, clothing, and sometimes even finances. Early Sanskrit literature, such as the Kama Sutra and various Dharmashastra texts, present idealized models of the housewife as skilled, graceful, and wise, attuned to aesthetics, rituals, and the rhythms of nature. Though these were prescriptive texts, they reflect the value placed on women's knowledge in both practical and spiritual domains. Among the upper classes, particularly in royal courts and merchant guilds, some women received formal education, especially in literature, music, and the fine arts. Poetry, attributed to women, appears in classical anthologies, and inscriptions reference learned women who engaged in philosophical discussions or composed verses in Sanskrit and Prakrit. In dramas from the time, like those of Kalidasa, female characters are depicted as intelligent, eloquent, and emotionally complex. Shakuntala, for instance, is not merely a romantic figure, but a woman of moral conviction and quiet strength. Queens and royal consorts often wielded subtle political influence. Kumara Devi, the wife of Chandragupta I, appears alongside him on coins, an unusual and powerful symbol of partnership in governance. Women of royal households frequently sponsored temple construction, land grants, and charitable works. Some were active in diplomacy, especially through marriage alliances that forged bonds between kingdoms. Though their power was rarely overt, it was present in their roles as advisors, negotiators, and cultural patrons. Religious life offered another avenue of visibility and agency. Women played important roles in ritual practice, especially in goddess worship. Festivals such as Navaratri and Vasant Panchami were centered around female deities like Durga, Lakshmi, and Saraswati, and women led many of these rites within households and communities. In sculpture and temple art from the Gupta period, goddesses are portrayed with strength and serenity, embodying both ferocity and nurturance. The divine feminine was not marginal, it was central, and this reverence extended, however imperfectly, to societal attitudes toward women. There were also women who pursued lives of spiritual renunciation, though rarer than their male counterparts. Female ascetics, known as Sanyasinis or Bhikkhunis, in Buddhist communities, existed and traveled across the empire. Some joined monastic orders or lived as wanderers, dedicating their lives to meditation, ethical conduct, and the pursuit of liberation. In Jainism, female mendicants or aryikas were more common and respected for their discipline and spiritual rigor. These women challenged norms of domesticity and demonstrated that spiritual aspirations transcended gender. In economic life, women contributed both directly and indirectly. In villages, they participated in farming, weaving, pottery, and animal care. In towns and cities, some engaged in textile production, sold goods in local markets, or worked in family-run businesses. Inscriptions mention guilds with female members, especially in crafts like dyeing, perfume making, and ornament design. These professions allowed women some measure of financial autonomy, even if property rights remained limited. Dowries were common, but so were gifts of jewelry or household wealth retained by women throughout their lives. Yet, for all these instances of agency, the limitations and inequalities of the time cannot be ignored. Patriarchal expectations around obedience, chastity, and familial duty were deeply entrenched. Girls were typically married young, often to older men, and their autonomy was heavily mediated through fathers, husbands, and sons. Widowhood could bring social stigma, and while practices like satitha, self-immolation of widows, were rare during the Gupta period, early references to it appear in this era. The caste system also shaped women's lives sharply, with access to education, public space, and social mobility largely reserved for the elite. Despite these restrictions, the cultural and symbolic power of women remained potent. In Gupta art, women are depicted with grace and presence dancing, reading, offering prayer, or simply existing in moments of quiet dignity. Their bodies are stylized with softness and strength, adorned with jewelry and expressive gestures. The female form, far from hidden or vilified, was celebrated as both muse and vessel of divinity. Whether in the sinuous lines of a temple sculpture or the lyrical verse of a court poet, womanhood was rendered with reverence, sensuality, and complexity. As you settle into stillness now, imagine a scene from a Gupta village as evening falls. A woman finishes grinding herbs for the night's meal. Another lights an oil lamp at the family shrine. Children listen as their grandmother tells a story of Durga slaying the buffalo demon. In a nearby town, a poetess sets down her stylus, her latest verse complete, and far away in a royal court, a queen reads aloud from a Sanskrit manuscript, her voice steady, her thoughts sharp. As twilight settles across the rooftops of Ujjain, and the final conch is blown at the temple steps, the pace of the Gupta world softens. Markets close, oil lamps flicker to life in quiet courtyards, and laughter rises gently from homes where family members gather to share their evening hours. With the labors of the day behind them, people turn to pastime and pleasure, to games, music, dance, and storytelling. And in this golden age of peace and prosperity, leisure itself became a kind of art. The Gupta era was not only a time of intellectual and spiritual achievement, it was also an age that celebrated joy, recreation, and aesthetic experience. From village squares to royal courts, people of all classes engaged in diversions that ranged from the playful to the profound. Games were more than amusements. They sharpened the mind, strengthened bonds, and passed the hours in beauty and delight. Music and dance, deeply integrated with ritual and devotion, also served as expressions of emotion and celebration, bringing people together in moments of shared rhythm and feeling. One of the most iconic contributions of Gupta India to world culture was the development of chaturanga, the ancestor of modern chess. Played on an 8x8 board and involving 4 distinct divisions: elephants, chariots, cavalry, and foot soldiers, chaturanga was a game of strategy, skill, and foresight. Originally conceived as a way to simulate battle, it was played by princes and scholars alike, who used it to hone tactical thinking and patience. Over time, chaturanga would evolve, traveling along trade routes to Persia, Arabia, and eventually Europe, where it became the modern game of chess. Yet its origin lies here, in the shaded galleries of Gupta palaces, where kings and courtiers sat hunched over boards carved from ivory and sandalwood, contemplating their next move. Other board games were also widely played. Pachisi, known in modern times as Ludo, had early versions that were popular in Gupta society. Played with cowrie shells or dice, it was often laid out on cloth boards in cross-shaped patterns. The game emphasized luck, movement, and quick decisions-making, it a favorite among families and children. Gambling, though officially discouraged in sacred texts, found its way into Gupta leisure life as well. Dice games were played both for entertainment and with wagers, drawing on traditions dating back to the Mahabharata, where even gods and kings faced fate at the throw of the die. Outside of homes, physical games and sports kept bodies strong and spirits high. Wrestling, archery, and horse racing were common pastimes, especially among kshatriyas and youth in training. Archery contests were held during festivals and religious gatherings, where boys and young men competed for skill and speed. In village commons and palace courtyards, people played games like tag, ball, and mock duels, often accompanied by laughter and cheer. Acrobatics, rope walking, and even forms of martial dance were practiced both for defense and entertainment. Music, however, was perhaps the most cherished form of leisure and expression. The Gupta Age saw the flourishing of classical Indian music, with instruments such as the veena, flute, mridangam, and cymbals gracing courts and temples alike. Music was both secular and sacred, performed during rituals, royal banquets, and household ceremonies. Melodic frameworks called ragas were used to evoke specific moods or times of day, while rhythmic cycles, known as talas, gave structure to performances. Music was understood not merely as sound, but as a path to harmony, a bridge between the human and the divine. Dance, closely tied to music, was equally revered. The foundations of what we now know as barotonadium and other classical forms were being shaped during this period. Dance was performed in temples as an offering to gods, but also in public performances for the enjoyment of spectators. Dancers, often women trained from a young age, learned complex gestures, expressions, and narrative sequences that conveyed epic stories or devotional messages. These were not frivolous entertainments. They were spiritual disciplines, with each movement and glance rooted in symbolism and tradition. Storytelling formed the very heart of Gupta recreation. Families gathered at night to listen to tales from the Ramayana, Mahabharata, and Jataka stories, a tradition passed orally from generation to generation. Traveling bards and performers recited epic poetry, interweaving performance with moral teaching. Puppetry and shadow plays entertained both children and adults. Some storytellers were monks who used narrative to communicate religious ideas. Others were secular entertainers, bringing laughter with tales of animals, tricksters, or foolish kings. In every case, storytelling was more than a pastime. It was a community ritual, linking people to their history, values, and one another. Even in the realm of visual art, there was room for leisurely creation. Villagers painted floors and walls with colored powders during festivals, creating temporary mandalas and floral patterns known as alpana or rangoli. Children made clay toys, while artisans carved small figurines of animals, dancers, and deities. In wealthier households, patrons commissioned murals or decorative sculptures to adorn their homes, reflecting not only wealth, but a love of beauty. Art, like all other pastimes, was both personal and communal, a joyful affirmation of life's color and texture. What unified these varied pleasures was a sense of balance and rhythm, so central to Gupta philosophy. Leisure was not an escape from duty, it was a complement to it. The same hand that offered rice at the altar might also move a pawn across a chessboard. The same voice that recited Vedic mantras in the morning might sing a love song by moonlight. The Gupta world did not separate work and play. sacred and secular, discipline and delight. It saw them as parts of a greater harmony, a life lived in tune with the self, the seasons, and the society. And now, as you lie back and let your breath fall into rhythm, imagine the soundscape of a Gupta evening, the distant strum of a veena, the soft beat of a drum, the laughter of children at play, and the lilt of a story whispered into the night. Let the music of that world enter your dreams, not as noise, but as gentle melody, inviting you to rest. For in the golden stillness of this age, joy was not fleeting. It was woven into life itself. As the golden days of the Gupta Empire rolled on, like the serene waters of the Ganges flowing through sun-drenched plains, few could have imagined that the stillness would one day tremble. Yet all things under the sun bear the weight of impermanence. Even the most luminous of golden ages casts shadows in the late decades of the Gupta reign. Those shadows began to lengthen. Tonight, we walk quietly into the twilight of the empire, when the rhythm of prosperity met the first discordant notes of unrest, and the calm assurance of Gupta strength began to fray at the edges. Though Chandragupta II's reign had ushered in a peak of cultural and political achievement, the seeds of future instability were already sown. His successors, most notably Kumaragupta I and later Skandagupta, inherited a vast and diverse realm. Maintaining such an empire required not only wise leadership, but sustained economic resources, strategic diplomacy, and vigilant defense. But challenges were rising, some from within, others from distant frontiers, quiet at first, but gathering momentum like monsoon clouds on the horizon. One of the most persistent and destabilizing threats came from the northwest, across the Indus River and beyond the Hindu Kush Mountains. Tribal confederations, known collectively as the Hunastha, Indian branch of the Central Asian Huns, were beginning to stir. Nomadic and battle-hardened, these groups had already rattled the great powers of the West. They had toppled empires in Persia and menaced the borders of Rome. Now, drawn by the riches of Gupta India, they turned their eyes southward. The Hunnas were not merely raiders, they were harbingers of upheaval, and their eventual incursion would mark the beginning of the end for Gupta supremacy. But the dangers were not solely external. Internally, the vast Gupta realm was beginning to strain under its own complexity. The decentralized system that once allowed for local autonomy and imperial coherence began to show signs of fragmentation. As power filtered through regional governors and vassal kings, loyalty sometimes gave way to ambition. Small dynasties in the periphery grew stronger, more self-reliant, and less inclined to seek the center's favor. Local identities, linguistic, religious, and political, started to reassert themselves. Though these movements were not rebellious in the violent sense, they signaled a shift away from imperial cohesion toward regional autonomy. Compounding this was the economic pressure brought on by military defense. Skandagupta, who ruled during the mid-5th century, is credited with repelling significant Hunna invasions. Inscriptions from his reign speak of valor, sacrifice, and divine favor in the face of barbarian threats. But war is expensive. To maintain border defenses, pay soldiers, and fortify cities, the state drew heavily on its treasury. Land grants became more frequent, often at the expense of direct tax revenue. Coinage debased subtly over time. The intricate balance between wealth, patronage, and governance that had supported the Golden Age began to wobble. Famine and natural disasters may have also played a role. Though the Gupta period benefited from generally favorable climate and agricultural yields, the subcontinent is never far from environmental unpredictability. Crop failures, floods, or droughts sustained over consecutive years could unsettle even the most resilient economy. Relief systems, largely dependent on local temples and elite generosity, could not always meet the scale of rural distress. Hungry villages, unable to pay taxes or send goods to market, fed the slow erosion of imperial stability from the ground up. Culturally, the Gupta Empire continued to shine, but even here, subtle changes were afoot. As political unity waned, artistic and architectural styles became more regionally distinct. The unifying aesthetic of Gupta sculpture and temple design, once so harmoniously balanced, began to fragment into localized traditions. This wasn't necessarily a decline in quality. Many regional styles were vibrant and inventive, but it marked a decentralization of cultural identity, reflective of shifting political realities. Religious life, too, was evolving. The embrace of bhakti, personal devotion to gods like Vishnu, Shiva, and the goddess, began to gain momentum, especially in villages and among the lower castes. While the Gupta era had celebrated religious diversity and philosophical exploration, a more emotional, populist form of religiosity began to emerge. This shift helped shape the future of Indian spiritual life in powerful and lasting ways, but it also suggested a departure from the intellectual, courtly tradition that had flourished under earlier rulers. In its place came new forms of expression, songs, poetry, and temple rituals that would define the post-Gupta world. By the late 5th century, the Huna invasions intensified. Under the leadership of Toramana and his successor, Mihirakula, the Hunas penetrated deep into the heart of India. Cities were sacked, temples were desecrated. Local rulers scrambled to defend their territories, sometimes allying with one another, sometimes surrendering. The Guptas, weakened and overextended, could not mount a cohesive response. Though some battles were won, the momentum had shifted. The center could no longer hold, and the empire began to fracture into a mosaic of smaller kingdoms. Yet even as the political map of India changed, the memory of the Gupta Golden Age endured. Its ideals of just kingship, its reverence for knowledge, its celebration of art and philosophy, these remained embedded in the collective consciousness. Later dynasties, such as the Harshas, the Pallas, and the Cholas, would look back to the Guptas as a model of classical order and refined governance. The decline of the empire did not erase its influence. Rather, it allowed that influence to flow into new vessels, carried forward by poets, scholars, and sages. And so, as we rest tonight in the quiet before the fall, let us not think of this chapter as a lament, but as a gentle turning of the page. The twilight of the Gupta Empire, while tinged with loss, was not a collapse, but a transformation. It was a reminder that even golden ages are subject to time's patient erosion, that every empire must eventually return its riches to the earth, its echoes to the wind. Let that lesson carry you into dreams, for in the fading light of greatness there is still grace, and in the soft footsteps of retreat there are whispers of resilience. Sleep now beneath the gathering clouds, and let the hush of a world in transition wrap you like a shawl. The dawn will come again different, yet still bearing the traces of golden days. The final embers of a fire burn the longest, glowing softly in the dark, long after the flames have faded. So too with the Gupta Empire. though its political structure fractured and its borders receded under the weight of invasions and regional fragmentation. Its cultural legacy burned on quiet, but radiant within the soul of the Indian subcontinent. In this chapter, we walk not through bustling courts or victorious battlefields, but through memory itself, through the living echoes of Gupta thought, aesthetics, and ideals that shaped South Asia for centuries to come. In history, not all empires are remembered equally. Some are chronicled for their conquests, others for their ruins. The Guptas, however, are remembered for their grace, their harmony, and the high watermark of classical civilization they achieved. Even after their political dissolution, the art, literature, science, and moral philosophy cultivated under their reign continued to flourish in temples, schools, and households. Their influence was not limited to stone and scripturate, rippled outward, guiding future generations across multiple domains of human endeavor. One of the most profound aspects of Gupta legacy was the institutionalization of classical Sanskrit culture. While Sanskrit had long been used in religious and philosophical texts, the Guptas helped elevate it as the standard language of governance, scholarship, and high art. Court poets, like Kalidasa, dramatists, philosophers, and grammarians, wrote in this language, setting the stylistic and rhetorical norms that would dominate Indian literary traditions for centuries. Even long after the Guptas themselves were gone, Sanskrit continued to be revered as the language of refinement, ritual, and reason, tying courts and communities together in a shared intellectual lineage. Their aesthetic vision, marked by balance, grace, and idealized forms, also endured. Guptara sculpture became the template for Indian religious art, influencing Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain iconography alike. The gentle curves, serene expressions, and symbolic gestures found in Gupta carvings were replicated and reinterpreted across vast geographies, from the rock-cut temples of Ajanta to the statuary of Southeast Asia. Later dynasties, like the Pallavas and Cholas, carried this artistic DNA forward, embedding Gupta ideals into new regional styles. Even today, when one visits a Hindu temple or gazes upon an ancient bronze, the fingerprints of Gupta artisans can still be felt. In science and mathematics, the Gupta period left behind discoveries and frameworks that outlived empires. The decimal system, concepts of zero, and advancements in algebra and astronomy that were formalized or disseminated during this era formed the backbone of mathematical thought, not only in India, but eventually across the world. The works of Aryabhata and others were later translated into Arabic and then into Latin, becoming the foundation for much of medieval and Renaissance science. In this sense, Gupta knowledge traveled far beyond its borders, crossing continents and centuries to become part of global intellectual heritage. Equally lasting was the Gupta contribution to political theory and statecraft. Texts like the Arthashastra, though predating the Guptas, found renewed relevance during their rule and were applied with sophistication. The Gupta model of decentralized governance balancing imperial authority with regional autonomy served as a blueprint for later Indian empires. Even when the Guptas themselves vanished from the political stage, their ideas lived on in the courts of Harsha, the Rashtrakutas, and the Cholas, who emulated their style of kingship, ceremonial grandeur, and emphasis on cultural patronage. Religious and spiritual traditions also bore the mark of Gupta influence. The rise of devotional movements, bhakti, traditions that emphasized personal connection to deities, found fertile ground in the pluralistic, tolerant atmosphere cultivated by the Guptas. By supporting multiple faiths without enforcing orthodoxy, they allowed Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism to evolve organically. This environment of coexistence and innovation helped lay the foundation for the rich tapestry of Indian religiosity that continues to thrive today. Moreover, the Gupta period helped shape the self-image of Indian civilization. In later centuries, when historians, poets, and reformers looked back to define what India had once been on, what it might become, they often evoked the Gupta Age. It became a cultural touchstone, a symbol of balance between prosperity and piety, strength and softness, intellect and emotion. During the colonial era, Indian nationalists would look back on this period with pride, holding it up as evidence of India's ancient greatness and civilizational maturity. The term Golden Age was not coined lightly. It was a collective memory wrapped in aspiration. Even outside the subcontinent, Gupta India left impressions. Through trade and religious missions, Gupta influence spread to Southeast Asia, where Indian epics, temple styles, and administrative systems were adopted by kingdoms like Srivijaya, Funan, and Angkor. Sanskrit inscriptions in Cambodia and Java, sculptures of Indian deities in Vietnam and Thailand all attest to the cultural export of Gupta ideals. In this way, their legacy became part of a Pan-Asian narrative, woven into the history of lands far from the Ganges plain. And yet, Gupta legacy is not merely academic. It lives in daily rituals, classical music, spiritual practices, and educational traditions across South Asia. When a child recites a Sanskrit verse in a modern school, when a temple dancer performs a story from the Mahabharata, when a mathematician invokes zero as a placeholder, they are unknowingly echoing the past. The Gupta Age is not just history, it is inheritance. As we return from this long journey through time, imagine standing at the edge of a river at twilight, the sky awash in purples and gold. The air is filled with distant chants, the soft trickle of water, and the rustle of palm leaves. Behind you lies the memory of palaces, poets, and pilgrims. Ahead lies the present, still shaped in ways both large and small by the light of that long-gone empire. Let that light rest softly on your thoughts as sleep approaches. Let the wisdom, beauty, and serenity of Gupta India wrap around you like a silk shawl. The empires may fall, the kings may fade, but their gifts remain quiet, enduring, and ever present in the dreams of a world that once was. In the hush of early morning, when shadows stretch long across the temple steps and birds begin their first calls beneath terracotta-tiled eaves, the structures of Gupta India stir not with noise, but with presence. Though the emperors have long since passed into dust, their vision lives on in stone. Carved pillars, sculpted shrines, and cave temples still stand, holding centuries of prayer and silence. In this chapter, we explore the architectural legacy of the Guptas, not only as builders of temples and monuments, but as weavers of sacred space, harmony, and cosmic symbolism into the very bones of the land. Gupta architecture marked a turning point in Indian building traditions, transitioning from temporary wooden constructions to more permanent and refined forms in stone and brick. While earlier periods had seen grand structures, particularly under the Mauryas and in the Buddhist stupas of the Shungas and Satavahanas, the Gupta period gave rise to a distinctly Indian temple style, one that combined religious function, aesthetic form, and cosmic order in ways that would define subcontinental architecture for over a millennium. One of the earliest and most celebrated examples of Gupta temple architecture is the Dashvatara temple at Deoghar. dating to the early 6th century CE, dedicated to Vishnu. The temple sits upon a raised square platform with a sanctum in the center. Once capped with a shikara rising tower structure that became the hallmark of North Indian temple design. Though the tower is now lost, the base and intricate sculptural panels remain. These panels depict scenes from the Ramayana and Vishnu's incarnations with a narrative fluidity and compositional grace that are breathtaking in their balance and precision. Here, we see not just a place of worship, but a sculpted philosophy and attempt to embody the stories of the gods in stone. The Gupta architects were not only concerned with grandeur, they were deeply attuned to proportion, symmetry, and spiritual geometry. Temples were often laid out according to Vastu Shastra principles, aligning with cardinal directions and using sacred grids to mirror the cosmos. The Sanctum Sanctorum was conceived as the axis mundi, the center of the universe housing the deity and serving as a link between the earthly and the divine. Even the approach to the temple, through mandapas and vestibules, reflected the spiritual journey from the outer world to inner realization. Every curve of the arch, every lotus carved on a doorframe, was imbued with symbolic intent. Alongside freestanding temples, the Gupta period also saw the flourishing of rock-cut architecture, especially in Buddhist contexts. At sites like Ajanta, earlier caves were expanded and embellished during Gupta rule, transforming them into spaces of quiet grandeur. The Chaitya halls and viharas, with their pillared interiors, intricately carved facades, and serene Buddhas seated in meditation, offer some of the finest examples of early Indian architectural synthesis. These were not only places for monastic living and worship, they were sanctuaries of art filled with murals, frescoes, and sculptures that turned stone walls into living canvases of devotion. In many ways, Gupta architecture was a collaborative art form, convergence of sculptors, masons, painters, and patrons. The sculptural decoration on temples and shrines was not merely ornamental, but narrative. It told stories of deities in cosmic play, of sages in meditation, of kings offering homage. The human figures were idealized yet expressive, captured in moments of dance, dialogue, and devotion. These carvings, like the texts of the time, emphasized balance, serenity, and beauty, making even small village shrines places of artistic sophistication. What's remarkable is how localized and diverse Gupta architecture became, even while maintaining core aesthetic values. In Mathura, temples reflected a continued connection with Buddhist iconography and narrative art. In Snore, the Dhammik stupa was enlarged and embellished under Gupta patronage. In central India and the Deccan, Gupta-influenced Hindu temples began to take root, adapting to regional styles and materials. This flexibility allowed Gupta architecture to be both unifying and adaptive, laying the groundwork for later regional schools like the Nagara and Dravida traditions. The legacy of Gupta architecture is perhaps most visible in what came after. Later dynasties, the Pratiharas, Palas, Cholas, and beyond would take the Gupta temple as a blueprint, refining and expanding upon its forms. The soaring towers of Khajuraho, the granite marvels of South Indian temples, and even the vast temple complexes of Angkor Wat in Cambodia all owe something to the Gupta architectural grammar. The Gupta temple became a template for sacred space, endlessly reimagined but rarely surpassed in conceptual clarity. Yet, Gupta architecture wasn't confined to the sacred. Urban planning, though less visible today due to the perishability of materials, was equally refined. Gupta cities, like Pataliputra, Ujjain and Nalanda featured structured layouts, drainage systems, and residential zones. Palaces, though mostly lost to time, were said to be adorned with frescoes, colonnades, and ornamental gardens. Inscriptions describe lotus pools, courtyards shaded by mango trees, and multi-storied towers painted with vivid dyes. These were spaces meant not just for display, but for living in beauty, reflecting an ethos that saw no division between the practical and the poetic. As night falls and your mind softens into quiet, imagine yourself walking barefoot across the stone floor of a Gupta temple. Your hand grazes the carved lotus petals on a doorway as the scent of incense drifts past. A bell chimes in the sanctum, low and resonant. The walls around you are alive with stories, frozen in gentle curves of stone. And though the empire has faded, its vision endures here, in this space shaped by hands long gone, but hearts still present. Let that stillness guide you into rest. For in the enduring grace of Gupta architecture, we find not just monuments, but messages of harmony, devotion, and the beauty of form infused with spirit. These echoes in stone, still standing beneath sun and moon, remind us that greatness is not only in what we build, but in what we imagine can last. As the last pages of our journey through the Gupta Empire begin to turn, a gentle question arises. What truly makes an age golden? Is it the stability of borders or the wisdom of rulers? Is it the sculptor's touch on stone or the mathematician's symbols on parchment? Is it the stillness of temples or the laughter of games? In this final chapter, we do not recount conquests or catalog innovations. Instead, we reflect on the deeper essence of a golden age, what it meant for those who lived through it, and what it still offers to us, centuries later, as dreamers in the quiet hush of night. To those who walked the roads of Gupta India, farmers tending their rice fields, scholars debating under banyan trees, artisans chiseling deities from granite, the Golden Age was not a term, but a feeling. It was found in the order of the seasons, the predictability of justice, the safety of markets, and the presence of learning. It was the idea that life, though imperfect, could be shaped with intention and grace, that there was enough room for thought and prayer, for laughter and story, that time could slow just enough to allow for beauty to bloom. The Guptas did not invent prosperity, nor did they conquer as widely as others, but they created something rare in history, a sustained cultural harmony. They were stewards rather than tyrants, nurturers of tradition rather than burners of books. They allowed knowledge to expand, temples to rise, and languages to evolve. Their administration, tolerant and layered, avoided the brutal centralization of some empires and the chaotic fragmentation of others. And in that middle ground, something precious took root, a civilization that grew inward, deepening its soul rather than merely expanding its reach. This was an age that embraced the full spectrum of human experience. There was room for the astronomer peering at stars, and for the dancer losing herself in rhythm. There was room for quiet temple rituals, and for bustling debates at university gates. Women shaped the rhythms of homes, and occasionally the fate of kingdoms. Merchants counted cowrie shells, and poets counted syllables. Farmers watched the skies for rain, and sculptors watched their chisels for truth. All these lives, woven together, formed the living tapestry of the Gupta world. And this inclusivity extended beyond borders. While the Gupta Empire was rooted in the Indian heartland, its influence crossed mountains and oceans. Its Buddhist missionaries carried ideas to Sri Lanka, China, and Southeast Asia. Its scripts and aesthetics traveled with traders and travelers. Even today, echoes of Gupta philosophy, style, and thought can be traced in distant lands. Their age was not insular. It was curious, outward-looking, and quietly expansive, leaving footprints not through force, but through inspiration. Yet perhaps what made the Gupta age most golden was its trust in continuity, the belief that wisdom is not disposable, that the past holds value, and that truth resides as much in preservation as in change. They honored the Vedas, but allowed for innovation. They revered ancient gods, but welcomed new forms of devotion. They recorded history not in boastful inscriptions of conquest, but in plays, poems, and parables. And by doing so, they invited posterity to remember them, not through ruins, but through resonance. Even in decline, the Gupta legacy did not shatter. It softened. It seeped into the soil, into the languages and rituals of villages, into the philosophies of monks and the crafts of artisans. Later dynasties rose on its shoulders. Nationalists invoked it to reclaim pride. Children learned its stories at their grandmother's side, and scholars, centuries later, would piece together its brilliance from coins, temples, and manuscripts, astonished at how much light could emanate from a time so distant. So what, then, is a golden age? Perhaps it is not a crown atop a king's head or the gleam of gold in a vault. Perhaps it is a moment in history when the human spirit is allowed to breathe, to think, to create, and to be kind. When people wake each day with the sense that the world, though fragile, is worthy of care. When art and science walk hand in hand, and where even power bows before the quiet dignity of truth. As you drift into rest now, picture a quiet morning in a Gupta town. The air is thick with the scent of jasmine and ghee. A mother hums to her child as the first rays of sun strike the edge of a stone temple. Nearby, a scribe sharpens his stylus. A potter's wheel turns. A schoolmaster opens his scroll. Life is beginning again, ordinary yet full of grace. The empire is still intact, the rhythm still holds, and the dream still living. Let that dream carry you into sleep. Let the hush of this golden age, with its gentle wisdom and enduring beauty, settle over your thoughts like a warm blanket. The stories have been told, the stars are out, and all is still. The world you've walked tonight of poets, sculptors, astronomers, and kings will be waiting again, should you ever return. For in the soft light of memory and imagination, the Gupta dream never ends.